Hey guys, tonight we drift slowly into the marble corridors of ancient Rome. Not the grand Senate halls or the echoing forums, but the quieter, more intimate spaces where whispers carried more weight than proclamations. Picture yourself beneath flickering lamplight, winding through narrow alleyways where mosaics wink with mischief and statues seem to watch. Even in sleep, these sculpted figures bear messages about power, control, and desire, none of them subtle. You've probably heard stories about Roman debauchery, lavish orgies, and wine-soaked escapades. But here's the twist. For the Romans, what happened in bed was rarely about romance. It was about rank, about domination, about reinforcing who stood above and who lay below, quite literally. So if you're imagining candlelit passion, gentle pillow talk and loving glances, well, you probably wouldn't have survived 5 minutes in a Roman bedroom. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video, subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step into a wealthy Roman villa, cool stone underfoot, the faint scent of lavender oil clinging to the air. Around you, walls adorned with frescoes don't shy away from nudity, they flaunt it. There's nothing bashful here. The art is brash, sometimes cartoonish, but always purposeful. A naked Venus lounges beside Mars, their eyes meeting over a stunned-looking Vulcan. Meanwhile, a triumphant Hercules boasts a lion pelt and, well, other exaggerated proportions. These are not private decorations, they're statements, because in Rome, to be sexually dominant was to be powerful, and to be powerful was to be publicly admired. Even statues followed the script. You pass a marble bust of a general, stoic face, square jaw, heroic stance, but look lower and, yep, he's not modestly sculpted. That wasn't vanity, it was visual propaganda. His body didn't just show strength, it shouted control, virility, even political legitimacy. Romans didn't believe sex belonged in the shadows. Instead, they painted it, chiseled it, joked about it at dinner. But always on their own terms. For elite Roman men, asserting control over others, especially sexually, was a symbol of their superiority. And that superiority had to be visible. If it wasn't seen, did it really happen? Of course, this worked within a very narrow definition. The passive partner, especially if male, faced serious judgment. Submission, in Roman eyes, equaled weakness. If you were a freeborn man and people whispered you'd been penetrated, that wasn't just rude gossip, it could derail your entire political career. Historians still argue whether certain senators lost favor due to such rumors, or if the smear campaigns were simply tools of convenience. Either way, reputations cracked faster than old frescoes. But don't think this was just about politics. Even in private, Roman couples, if we can call them that, performed roles based on hierarchy, not intimacy. The goal wasn't mutual pleasure, it was to reinforce the social order. Husbands dominated, wives submitted, slaves had no say. Prostitutes, of which there were many, operated legally but with no rights. Everything reinforced a single message: you are only as powerful as the position you hold, in bed and out. One quirky bit: Roman doorframes often featured tiny carved penises, not decorative, not playful, protective. These were fascinates, phallic amulets believed to ward off evil and jealousy. You'd be walking into someone's home and bam, tiny stone member right at eye level. Don't take it personally. It was supposed to keep demons from peeking in. Power bled into architecture too. The bedroom, called the cubiculum, wasn't always private. In fact, some opened directly into the atrium. That's right, a little curtain separated your sleeping space from a common area. Privacy? Optional. Performative dominance? Mandatory. You wander through another home, this one preserved in the ashes of Pompeii. On the walls, scenes of Dionysian feasts, satyrs frolicking with nymphs, gods seducing mortals in increasingly acrobatic poses. One corner mosaic shows a couple mid-act, with a third figure playing the panpipes nearby, entirely unbothered. It's a vibe, and a reminder that for Romans, sex wasn't shameful, it was strategic. Erotic art wasn't for titillation, it was for boasting. The same mosaic might be found in a bathhouse, in a dining room, even over a bed. The message, I'm cultured, I'm in control, and I've got nothing to hide. You could argue their entire worldview was, I conquer, therefore I am. Still, not everyone agreed with the free-for-all. Some Stoics, the philosophical kind, not the statues, warned against giving in to lust. Seneca, for instance, preached self-restraint. He said indulgence weakened the mind, but did anyone listen? Probably not. He was executed, not for celibacy, mind you, but it didn't help his PR. As you tiptoe past another bedroom mosaic, this one featuring a couple so tangled it's hard to tell whose limbs are whose, you realize something else. Pleasure here wasn't just about the physical. It was about performance, appearance, legacy. Who could be seen as the master, even in the most private of acts? And yes, there were exceptions. We'll get to those. The poets who fell in love, the philosophers who questioned everything, the rebels who lived differently, but even they swam against the current of power as passion. Tonight, you've only just cracked the marble door open. Tomorrow you'll step further into laws, loopholes, lovers, and lunacy. But for now, let the sound of sandals brushing smooth stone follow you into rest. The air grows softer, the frescoes fade, and somewhere a statue smiles knowingly into the dark. You shuffle slowly down the colonnaded corridor of a Roman domus, and your fingers trail along cool travertine columns, still faintly echoing with the whispers of dinner guests long gone. But your eyes catch on something more curious, a figure moving ahead of you, wrapped in folds of ivory wool. A toga. Not just any toga, though. This one's stiff, ceremonial, almost deliberately awkward. You blink, and suddenly you remember, this isn't just a garment, it's a message. In Rome, clothing didn't just cover the body, it signaled your place in the world like a walking resume. A woman's stola marked her as a respectable wife. A freedman wore a cap, a sort of, I used to be enslaved, but now I pay taxes badge. But the toga? That was a power uniform. And oddly enough, it came with some very spicy implications. Let's unpack that. Slowly, like someone unpinning layers of wool in the Mediterranean heat. The toga virilis, or toga of manhood, was worn by freeborn Roman citizens, men only. If you were female, enslaved, or, heaven forbid, an actor, no toga for you. But then there's the toga mulibris, a rare sight because respectable women didn't wear togas. In fact, if you saw a woman wearing one, she was probably a prostitute, or a widow, or someone who had, shall we say, fallen from grace. It was visual code for sexual availability or shame, depending on who was reading it. Now imagine walking down the street and your clothes tell everyone you've had 3 lovers, 2 divorces, and a very public scandal involving figs. That's basically what Roman clothing could do. This wasn't just fashion, it was reputation stitched in wool. And here's a twist. The colour of the toga also mattered. The toga candida, a brilliant white version, was reserved for men running for public office. It screamed, "Pick me, I'm pure," even if the wearer had just left a lupiner. Historians still argue whether this tradition was actually tied to real notions of virtue, or if it was just a way to blind voters into submission. Either way, the brighter the toga, the dirtier the politics. Then there's the toga praetexta, rimmed with a bold purple stripe. It was worn by boys not yet of age and by high-ranking officials. So yes, a 10-year-old and a judge could be twinning, one's eating figs, the other's sentencing people to death. Totally normal. But here's where things get even weirder. The toga pulla, dark, mournful and dramatic, worn during periods of grief or protest. That's right, protest. Romans didn't shout slogans or carry signs. They wore sad fashion. Picture a whole Senate assembly showing up in goth togas to say, "We are not okay with this legislation." Of course, not all Romans dressed to signal sex and power. Some dressed for comfort or tried to, but even then choices were scrutinized. Wearing your toga too short, indecent, too long, arrogant, Too loose? Lazy? Too tight? Show off. Honestly, you couldn't win. So you watch as our earlier toga wearer disappears around a corner, and now you're left wondering, how much did people really care? A lot, it turns out. Clothes could determine your fate. They weren't just judged, they were enforced. If you were on trial and didn't wear the appropriate garb, it could be used against you. Imagine showing up to court in the wrong shoes and being sentenced to exile. That's Roman justice. And then there's the synthesis, a colourful dining robe that screamed, "I'm relaxed, I'm fun, I'm ready to recline dramatically on a couch," but only during Saturnalia or private parties. Try wearing that to a public event, and you'd be branded a deviant. Again, very strict rules. Even their leisure wear had limits. One fringe tidbit. There was actually a law, the sumptuary laws, that limited how luxurious your clothes could be. Theoretically, these were to keep citizens from indulging in decadence. In practice, they were ignored more often than not. Nero, for example, was said to have worn slippers embroidered with pearls. Pearls on his feet. To be fair, when your palace rotates while you eat, your shoes better sparkle. But behind every robe and tunic was a subtle or not-so-subtle power play. You dressed not for yourself, but for the gaze of others. The way your fabric folded, the length of your hemline, the drape of your shoulder, it was all watched, judged, and interpreted. In fact, Romans believed that a man's ability to control his clothing reflected his ability to control everything else. If your toga slipped off mid-speech, career ending. There were slaves whose entire job was just to fold the master's toga correctly. Imagine dedicating your life to preventing a wardrobe malfunction. Now, you might be tempted to compare all this to modern fashion, but imagine if jeans announced your political allegiance, or if your hoodie suggested your moral worth. Actually, maybe we're not so different, but let's not rush past this strange Roman world too quickly. Instead, pause beneath an archway. You glance up at a mosaic showing a woman adjusting her veil. Elegant, dignified, aware of every eye. Her posture screams untouchable, but her expression dares you to try. That's the paradox of Roman fashion. It hid the body while revealing everything else. And as you drift onward, you hear faint laughter from a bathhouse nearby. Voices rise, a mix of flirtation and mockery. Because in Rome, no outfit was safe from satire. A toga too well wrapped might suggest you were hiding something, literally or figuratively. A loose tunic, lazy and immoral. And don't even get them started on sandals. Still, it all circles back to the same Roman obsession. Hierarchy. Who was above? Who was below? Who deserved to be gazed upon? And who didn't even deserve to be seen? And so, as your sandals whisper over mosaic floors and shadows grow long across the atrium, you realize that to dress in Rome was to declare war on obscurity. Every stitch, a weapon, every color, a signal, every fold, a gamble. Let your breath settle now. Let the folds of imagined linen gather softly at your feet. Let the candle flicker one last time before you step through the next curtain into the politics of Roman desire itself. The air is still now thick with the scent of olive oil and old scrolls as you drift deeper into the villa, past frescoes, past whispering doorways, until you arrive at the very rules that shaped Roman intimacy. It turns out, even behind closed doors, the Romans had a pecking order so strict it made their senatorial seating charts look relaxed. Welcome to the rigid world of who could sleep with whom, and why it mattered far more than how anyone felt. You probably expect that people in ancient times just did whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, right? No texting, no birth control, no rules. But actually Rome was obsessed with boundaries, especially in the bedroom. And unlike modern ideas of love or even passion, their sexual system was built entirely on one principle: power must flow in one direction only. Let's start at the top of the social pyramid, where power was practically baked into your breakfast. If you were a freeborn Roman male citizen, you could initiate sexual acts with women, men, slaves, or prostitutes, as long as one rule was upheld. You had to be the dominant partner. And no, that wasn't just a preference. It was the law of reputation. To be penetrated, to show submission even in private, That wasn't considered just embarrassing, it was emasculating, dangerous, a political liability. Historians still argue whether this ideology arose out of military culture, patriarchal paranoia, or some combination of both, but the effect was clear. Your masculinity wasn't just how you acted, it was what you did to others, which means Roman sexuality was never about mutuality. It was about enforcing your rank in society through other people's bodies. And those bodies, not all of them were considered equal. Take enslaved individuals, for instance. They were legally seen as property, and as such, they could not consent. Full stop. A Roman man could sleep with his male or female slaves and suffer no legal consequences, no raised eyebrows, not even a whisper of scandal. The enslaved had no rights, no bodily autonomy, no recourse. Their humanity was erased the moment they were bought. Now let's say you're a freedman, once enslaved, now technically free. Could you make your own romantic choices? Sort of. You could marry, yes, you could have children, but good luck trying to court a senator's daughter. Social mobility didn't extend to social mixing, especially not the romantic kind. And if your spouse came from a higher class, the pressure to stay submissive, to remain grateful and quiet, never truly left. But perhaps the most complicated and hypocritical space was reserved for Roman women. Respectable women, that is. The matrona was expected to be modest, silent, obedient, and sexually invisible, except when producing heirs. Her virtue was a family asset, her body, a vessel carefully guarded and strategically deployed. Fathers arranged her marriage, husbands controlled her freedom, and the stakes were high. A rumor of infidelity could end a marriage, damage a family's reputation, even lead to exile or death. And yet the double standard was breathtaking. While elite men could cavort with slaves, concubines, and prostitutes with impunity, their wives were expected to remain monuments of chastity. Roman moralists like Cato the Elder used to brag that their wives had never embraced another man. Meanwhile, they were probably dictating that from a bathhouse tryst. Then there were the meretrices, the registered prostitutes who operated within Rome's legal but morally frowned-upon system. They had no expectation of modesty, no protection of reputation. And though some earned significant income, even fame, they could never marry respectable men. Their profession made them forever other. A man could sleep with them, but not love them. Not legally, not publicly. And if he did, well, cue the family drama, the threats of disinheritance, and maybe a poetry slam or two. But it wasn't just about legality. There was an entire spectrum of sexual roles, each encoded with meaning. If you were a Roman man and preferred younger male partners, well, that was okay, as long as you remained the active one and the partner was of lower status. Even better if they were a slave. No threat there, but a fellow citizen, an equal. That was complicated, possibly shameful, possibly scandalous. There's even a term Cinedas used in Roman literature to describe effeminate or submissive men. It wasn't a compliment. It implied not only a preference for being dominated, but a total loss of dignity. These men were mocked in comedies, cursed in graffiti, and painted as cautionary tales. And yet, ironically, they're also some of the most vividly described characters in Roman literature. Maybe the obsession reveals something deeper. One quirky historical tidbit: Roman law had a loophole that allowed a man to sleep with a slave or prostitute without violating his marriage vows. In other words, adultery only applied if the woman was a citizen and someone else's wife. Technically, you could visit a brothel on the way to your own wedding and still be considered faithful in the eyes of Roman law. Not romantic, just Roman. You walk past a wall now, etched with graffiti from Pompeii. Romula was here with Rufus. He pleased her well. A rare moment of egalitarian pleasure, preserved in ash. But who wrote it? A woman taking agency? A man boasting on her behalf? A joke? Historians still argue the handwriting is casual, hurried, almost joyful. One line against a sea of silence. And silence, in many ways, is what surrounded most Roman relationships. Love, affection, emotional intimacy, they existed, but quietly, carefully. The risk of stepping outside one's assigned sexual role was simply too great. So you float now through a world where every act, every glance, every touch came with consequence, where pleasure was a transaction, where desire bent beneath duty, and where even the heart had to ask permission before it dared to speak. As your eyes grow heavy and the mosaic shadows shift along the marble floor, you can almost hear it, that whisper between breaths, the longing behind the law, the aching hush of all the love that power never let through the door. You find yourself in a shaded courtyard now, the kind where the scent of rosemary clings to the breeze and distant lyres hum their lazy tune. A woman sits nearby, veiled in a thin, gauzy stola, her sandals resting on tessellated tiles. She is still, serene, almost statuesque, but the stiffness in her shoulders tells another story. She is a matrona, a Roman wife, and though the world calls her respectable, virtuous, dignified, you begin to see the heavy cost of those titles. Marriage in Rome wasn't a love story, it was a strategy, a family alliance, a legal contract with footnotes about dowries, heirs and social climbing. The bride rarely had a say. Fathers arranged matches based on status and wealth, not affection. You can almost hear the negotiations. She's fertile, from a good house, knows her way around a loom. Yes, but your cousin's scandal knocked 20% off her dowry. And once married, the expectations didn't soften. They calcified. A Roman wife was meant to be chaste, obedient, and almost invisible. Her job was to uphold her husband's dignity by embodying silence and virtue. Even her fashion said so. Muted colors, high necklines, minimal jewelry, a walking shrine to modesty. Think of it as reverse peacocking. Yet, ironically, her behavior was under constant scrutiny. Roman writers, mostly male of course, loved to praise the ideal wife. She weaves wool and guards the house, they'd say, quoting the greats like Livy or Valerius Maximus. But they were less interested in her inner life than in how well she reflected her husband's honor. She wasn't just a partner, she was a mirror, polished to reflect male prestige. Still, not every marriage was cold. Some letters and poems survived that hint at warmth, even affection. One grieving husband wrote a tomb inscription calling his wife "my heart's solace and my loyal joy." Sweet, right? Except he also noted she had never spoken back to him once. Historians still argue whether that's proof of mutual love or just more patriarchal idealizing, probably both. The wife's sexuality was the family's most guarded treasure. Virginity before marriage wasn't just prized, it was documented. Midwives might examine a new bride to ensure purity, and rumors of premarital dalliances could wreck an engagement faster than a senator at a wine party. After marriage, fidelity was mandatory. Even suspicion of infidelity could land her in court. And yes, there were courts for this. Under the Lex Julia de Adulteriis, a husband could legally prosecute his wife for adultery. If convicted, she might be banished, lose her dowry, and suffer lifelong disgrace. What happened to the man she supposedly slept with? If he was a citizen, maybe exile. If a slave, probably execution. If the husband chose to look the other way, he could be prosecuted for not punishing her. That's how deeply Rome believed a man must control his household. Meanwhile, husbands could carry on with prostitutes, concubines, or slaves and face no consequences. Their honor didn't hinge on fidelity, it hinged on dominance. A man's pleasure was expected, a woman's pleasure was a liability. If she sought it outside the marriage, she was a deviant. If she sought it inside the marriage, she was probably wasting her time. And let's talk about divorce. Romans had no elaborate legal process, no courtroom, no mediation. If a husband wanted out, he could simply declare, "You are now your own woman," and that was that. She'd pack up her dowry, her children, maybe, and leave. Women could initiate divorce too, surprise, but only with substantial social risk. A divorced woman might face gossip, economic hardship, or worse, remarriage to someone even less tolerable. One quirky exception: the Emperor Augustus made divorce less socially acceptable, not out of love for marriage, but to encourage childbirth. His moral reforms aimed to increase the Roman birth rate by making adultery punishable and childlessness shameful. So yes, government-mandated baby-making. It was not popular. But perhaps the strangest detail? Husbands were sometimes expected to lend their wives to friends or allies to cement political relationships, purely ceremonial, of course. But historians debate whether these arrangements sometimes crossed into something more intimate. It's blurry. Rome was great at drawing lines, and even better at pretending they didn't move. And what of love? Did it exist in Roman marriage? Perhaps, sometimes, but rarely as the foundation. The poet Propertius once wrote, "Let other men tame wives with stern laws. Let me be ruled by a mistress who chains me with her eyes." That sentiment belonged to the poets, though, not the politicians. There were outliers. Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi brothers, was praised for her intelligence and moral strength. She raised her sons alone after her husband's death and was famously offered a royal marriage by the king of Egypt, which she declined. Instead, she remained in Rome and became a living symbol of maternal virtue. Still, even her legacy was tied to her sons' achievements. She was the mother of greatness, not great in herself. You pause now in a dim tablinum, the family archive room. Scrolls line the shelves, names etched in wax tablets, contracts, dowries, letters, all preserved. One wax seal is broken. Inside, a faded note. She danced too freely. The engagement is void. You close the tablet gently, heart sinking for a woman who probably just liked music. And yet the women of Rome found ways to live, to laugh, to scheme. Some formed tight bonds with their household slaves. Some took lovers in secret. Some wielded quiet influence over their husbands' decisions. They were not all passive. They endured, they adapted. Sometimes they even ruled from behind the curtain. As you step out into the open courtyard again, the sun has dipped lower, the shadows stretch longer, softening the marble. The woman in the stola is gone now, but her presence lingers. You realize that in Rome, to be a wife was to live on the edge of performance and control. And in that delicate dance, there was strength, however quiet. Let the olive trees rustle. Let the lyre grow quiet. Let the weight of those veils, those rolls, slip softly from your shoulders as you prepare to descend into deeper dreams. The villa grows quieter as you wander toward its edge, where the mosaic tiles give way to packed earth and half-shaded porticos. But there's something in the air tonight, tighter than tension, older than dust. It's the one thing no respectable Roman man wanted clinging to his name, shame by submission. You see, in the Roman world, everything was about hierarchy. But nowhere was that hierarchy more nervously policed than in the realm of male sexuality. A Roman man could dominate, he could command, he could parade through the forum with his toga just so, his slaves flanking him like punctuation marks. But if anyone suggested that he had played the passive role in sex, the political dagger had already found its sheath. Now, we're not talking about preference or identity here. Rome didn't divide people by attraction but by position, quite literally. To receive was to submit, and to submit was to surrender your masculine dignity. So even if the encounter was private, secret, whispered behind tightly drawn curtains, if it ever became public knowledge that you had been on the receiving end, metaphorically or otherwise, your status could collapse like a badly stacked amphora. This wasn't just social teasing. We're talking exile, disqualification from office, or worse, immortal humiliation in graffiti. You walk past one now, scrawled along a crumbling wall in Pompeii. Lucius, the man-wife, licks more than honey. Charming. And career-ending. The Latin word Sinidus appears again and again in Roman texts, a slur spat like venom at any man accused of being effeminate, flamboyant, or sexually passive. It didn't matter if the accusation was true. Just the suggestion could unmake a reputation. Historians still argue whether Sinidus described a real social type or was simply a catch-all insult for nonconformity. Either way, the message was clear. Rome had no tolerance for men who didn't uphold their end of the dominance bargain. And yet the contradictions were baked into their culture like fig cakes. Roman poets gleefully mocked senators and generals for supposed sexual submissiveness, even while writing odes to adolescent male beauty. Catullus, ever sharp-tongued, once hurled verses at a rival, accusing him of reeking with a boy's backside. Sophisticated stuff. Even Augustus, Mr. Moral Reform himself, wasn't safe. One particularly saucy rumour accused him of submitting to an Egyptian priest during his youth. His political enemies loved to whisper about it, especially once he started handing out laws about everyone else's bedroom behaviour, because, of course, nothing undermines your authority like a well-placed innuendo. This fear bled into sculpture too. Ever notice how Roman statues of male gods or heroes are idealized as muscular, composed and, let's say, modestly proportioned? That wasn't a mistake. Excessive size below the belt was actually considered vulgar, animalistic, low class. Too much implied you couldn't control yourself. You were at the mercy of your passions. And in Rome, control was everything. Contrast that with the grotesquely endowed satyrs or foreign barbarians carved into comedic reliefs. Those figures, often shown as exaggerated or overwhelmed by desire, were the butt of the joke, literally and figuratively. A Roman man was supposed to dominate but also stay cool, assertive, not desperate, controlled conqueror, not a panting pursuer. One fringe tidbit: there's record of a Roman magistrate who lost his entire senatorial future after rumours emerged that he had squeaked during intimacy. Just that? A sound enough to brand him forever as weak, effeminate, unfit. Can you imagine losing a political career because someone claimed you yelped? Rome could, and the obsession didn't stop with adults. Boys, especially those from elite families, were warned, sternly, obsessively, not to show effeminate tendencies. Tutors monitored how they walked, spoke, gestured, crossed legs, dangerous, soft voice, suspicious, lingered too long near a lyre or perfume stand. Better hope your father had good lawyers. But the real irony? The very same society that panicked over male submission also institutionalized it in others. Enslaved boys, called pueri delicati, were often chosen for their beauty and forced into sexual servitude. They were dressed in fine clothes, perfumed, and paraded before guests. No one blinked, no one stopped it. Rome carved a bright line between dominance and submission, and then filled its homes with people to play the losing side. That's how deep the rot went. Submission wasn't shameful in itself, it was shameful when performed by the wrong person. As long as the hierarchy was upheld, cruelty could pass as normal, even noble. You step out into a garden now, where statues peer through ivy and fountains trickle softly. One bust watches you with blank marble eyes, an anonymous youth, lips parted, curls stiff in the evening air. Perhaps he was once adored. Perhaps he was once destroyed by that very adoration. We'll never know. History preserves the names of emperors, not the whispers of their victims. And yet even in this cold system humanity broke through. Some men defied the roles. Some loved openly. Some dared to be tender in a culture that prized conquest. Their stories are rare, but they flicker at the edges of scrolls and poems like candlelight refusing to die. You pause now beneath a laurel tree, the breeze lifting your hair. The shame of submission, what a strange, fragile thing, built on fear, enforced by law, and clung to by men who could conquer nations, but not their own insecurities. Let the leaves rustle, let the rumours fade, and let your breath settle, quiet and even, as the marble walls remember all the things the poets never dared to write. The air grows heavier as you pass through a narrow corridor, its walls bearing the faded fingerprints of centuries. It opens into a modest chamber, dim, silent, lined with low wooden beds. No mosaics here, no frescoes, just shadows, because this is where we talk about those who had no voice in Roman bedrooms, the enslaved. You hesitate. You should. Everything about this room feels off. The walls don't breathe luxury. There's no laughter, no wine, no politics, just quiet compliance. And yet this is where much of Roman intimacy happened, not in the marble-walled cubicular of the elite, but in these forgotten corners where consent didn't matter and power never had to ask. In the Roman household, enslaved people were everywhere. They served food, swept floors, raised children. And yes, many were expected to provide sexual service too. It was common, normalized, and horrifically unremarkable. There were no rules against it. A Roman citizen could legally sleep with any enslaved person they owned, male or female, young or old. Desire was rarely the reason, control was. And the enslaved? They had no legal protection, no right to refuse, no way to report abuse. Roman law categorized them as property, res, not personae, objects, tools, which meant even the most brutal acts didn't count as crimes. Think about that. Your lamp had more say in your life than you did. Historians still argue whether this system was accepted with numb obedience or resisted in secret. Probably both. Enslaved people were human, after all, capable of hope, terror, wit, and love. Some may have forged quiet connections, found small escapes, but many more endured what couldn't be escaped, the violence that hid behind Roman ideals of order. And Roman society didn't just tolerate this, it wove it into the fabric of daily life. Elite men bragged about their favorites, in public letters, at dinner parties, in graffiti. One scratched message reads, "I took Lisa in the baths. She wept like the fountain." It's written like a joke, a power flex, a permanent scar carved in stone. Even literature echoed this cruelty. The poet Martial, known for his biting epigrams, described his slave boy's body in erotic terms, then joked about beating him if he disobeyed. It wasn't seen as controversial, just another witty quip between bites of peacock and figs. And it wasn't just adults. Enslaved children, pueri delicati, were often groomed to please. Plucked from conquered territories, chosen for their appearance, raised to be quiet, graceful, submissive. They were trained not just to serve, but to seduce. Not willingly, of course, never willingly. But Rome never asked the question. One chilling tidbit, enslaved people weren't allowed to marry, not legally. They could form emotional bonds, of course, they could raise children, but at any moment a master could separate them, sell one, punish another, dissolve a family with a flick of the stylus. There were no vows, no protection, no permanence, just the threat of erasure. Some masters permitted contubernum, a kind of unofficial cohabitation between enslaved individuals. If the couple was lucky, they might stay together for years. But it was always contingent on the owner's mood, debt, or whim. One bad harvest, and you could lose your partner, your child, your home. And what about resistance? It happened, quietly, cleverly. Some slaves faked illness to avoid their master's bed. Others formed covert alliances, whispered warnings, fled when they could. A few even took revenge. The historian Tacitus tells of a household slave who poisoned her owner after years of abuse. She was executed, of course, but for a moment, just a moment, she was no longer powerless. Still, the machine of Roman society rolled on. No scandal, no reform, no reckoning. Even the philosophers so chatty about justice and virtue mostly looked the other way. Seneca once advised a friend to treat slaves with kindness, not because it was right, but because familiarity breeds contempt, and contempt leads to bad service. Inspirational. And then there's Pliny the Younger, always eager to share his progressive ideas. He wrote about allowing his slaves to draft wills. Wills, as if they had property. As if that single symbolic gesture erased the nights they couldn't say no. You linger now by a rough wooden bed, a dent in the straw, a splintered bowl tucked beneath the frame. No names remain. Just the shape of a life lived without ownership. No letters, no records, just the echo of footsteps, the creak of wood, and perhaps the memory of someone who hoped, because even in this brutal system, humanity endured. The enslaved found ways to survive, through song, through stories, through the briefest flickers of dignity. One freedwoman, named Fortunata, eventually married her former master and became wealthy in her own right. Was it love? Was it strategy? Historians still debate. But she carved her name into stone and was remembered. That, in Rome, was its own kind of victory. You step out now into the garden again. The sun has faded. Only a single torch flickers near the threshold. You realize the ground beneath your feet, the empire itself, was built on backs that never had the chance to stand tall. Let the torch burn low, let the silence stretch, and let your breath deepen soft and steady as you honor all those whose names never made it to the scrolls, but whose lives nonetheless shaped the shadows of history. Your footsteps lead you down a narrow alleyway now, one you might have ignored earlier. But tonight something beckons, a soft glow from a crumbling doorway, the faint glint of bronze above the frame. As you duck beneath it, you find yourself in front of a Roman bedroom, but not just any. This chamber hums with old magic, its walls crowded with charms and curses. Welcome to the strange, protective, and occasionally petty world of phallic amulets and bedroom spells. You blink, and yes, that's a little winged penis dangling from the ceiling. Don't worry, you're not hallucinating. It's called a fascinum, and it's not here to be cheeky. It's here to ward off evil. To the Romans, sex was powerful, but dangerously so. Pleasure could attract envy, lust could bring misfortune. A whispered curse from a scorned lover might just shrink your status, or something else. So they fought fire with fire, specifically with tiny, flying penises armed with swords, bells, and sometimes even wings. Nothing says stay away bad luck like an aggressive bit of brass anatomy spinning in the breeze. These charms weren't hidden. You'd find them everywhere, above doorways, on necklaces, hanging from children's necks. Yes, really, even sewn into soldiers' uniforms. One historian joked that the Roman army marched to war jingling like festive wind chimes. But behind the absurdity lay real fear. The evil eye, the malocchio, was no joke. It was believed to cause infertility, impotence, jealousy, even death. And if the fascinum didn't work, well, there were always spells. You glance at a wax tablet tucked in the shadows. Etched into it are looping letters, Latin, yes, but not the polite kind, a typical defixio or curse tablet. The writer has named names, described intentions, and left offerings for spirits to enforce it. May Fabius never sleep again until he returns to me, it reads. Dramatic? Effective? Historians still argue sometimes these tablets were rolled up and nailed to tombs or dropped into wells. Others were slipped under beds or woven into mattresses. Some women tied knots in red thread while chanting names, hoping to bind the heart or other body parts of their beloved. Others crushed herbs into wine, whispering to Venus for a glimpse of loyalty. And if that failed, there were always snakeskin, dried mouse, and very specific mushrooms. It wasn't all curses, though. Many Romans carried bulla, small pendants filled with protective substances like wolf tooth, garlic peel, or bits of silver. These were especially popular with children, who wore them until adulthood, but lovers wore them too, hidden beneath their tunics. After all, nothing says commitment like a pouch of hair and wax meant to keep your partner faithful. And the graffiti, oh, the graffiti. You run your hand along a wall in Pompeii where someone once scratched, "May Tullia's thighs itch until she visits me again." Subtle, poetic, desperate. This wasn't just a plea, it was a spell disguised as a dirty joke. Because in Rome, words had power. A name spoken in the right way at the right time could summon or sabotage. Even objects held energy. Mirrors, for instance, weren't just for checking your toga folds. They were believed to reflect the soul, to capture intention. That's why you'd never find one left broken in a brothel or lover's room. To shatter a mirror wasn't just clumsy, it was dangerous. And candles? They weren't just for ambiance. Some were shaped like people, tiny wax effigies meant to represent the desired lover. You'd light the wick, whisper a spell, and hope the flame melted their resistance as it did the wax. ancient tinder, but with more fire risk. Then there were the herbs, lots of them: rue, mint, bay leaves, saffron. Some used to spark desire, others to cool it, and some, like silphium, a now extinct plant from North Africa, were prized for their contraceptive powers, so prized, in fact, that it was harvested into oblivion. One Roman coin even bears its image, a small, humble plant that shaped the fate of many secret rendezvous. One quirky historical tidbit: there's evidence that some Roman women carried small phallic amulets not for fertility, but to ward off gossip. Apparently, nothing shuts up a judgmental neighbour like flashing a little bronze fascinum their way. It's unclear if it worked, but you have to admire the effort. You move now toward a low shelf, cluttered with tiny clay figurines. Some are lovers entwined, others are alone, reaching. Each carries its own spell, etched or spoken. You wonder how many nights were spent whispering to these silent gods, how many hopes tucked into wax and wool, praying for someone to stay or go or come back kinder. These rituals weren't just superstition, they were the only tools many Romans had, especially women, slaves, or the poor. Powerless in law, they turned to magic, not out of madness but necessity, to influence, protect, survive. Magic was a shadow version of politics and often far more accessible. As you turn to leave, a breeze rattles the charms overhead. The fascinum spins slowly, casting odd, playful shadows across the stone. You smile, and for a moment you understand. In a world where love was a battlefield and sex a hierarchy, even the silliest amulet could feel like armor. Let the charms jingle, let the spells simmer, and let the soft rustle of red thread and candlelight guide you back to rest. The magic of Rome wasn't just in marble and conquest, it lingered here, in quiet chambers, in whispered names, and in the small, stubborn belief that sometimes hearts could still be swayed. You slip now into the southern district of Pompeii, where the air still smells faintly of ash and old lemon trees. Your sandals crunch gently over time-smoothed stones as you approach a low, dark building, once painted bright red, once lit by oil lamps, once echoing with laughter. You've arrived at one of Rome's most misunderstood institutions, the lupanar, or brothel. Forget the movies, forget the velvet and perfume. The real Roman brothel was practical, cramped, and not especially discreet. The word lupanar comes from lupa, Latin for she-wolf, a slang term for prostitute. A clever twist, really, since the Roman founding myth starts with twins suckled by a she-wolf. Maybe everything in Rome begins with a woman and a price. You duck through the doorway, and immediately the space closes around you. The ceiling is low, the air thick, the light dim even during the day. 5 tiny rooms branch off the hallway, each with a stone bed carved into the wall, just long enough for one client and one worker, though some were built for 3, depending on taste or price. The walls, however, are the main event. You look up and see them, frescoes, vivid and unapologetic, each one a little menu of services painted in bold strokes with labels like "Felix does it well" or "Calidus is fast but firm." They're not subtle, nor were they meant to be. For a largely illiterate population, visual instructions were the easiest form of advertisement. Some historians argue these weren't real employees being depicted, but fantasy scenes, an erotic catalogue of sorts. Others insist they were portraits of the actual workers, a kind of marketing before the age of business cards. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, as usual with Rome. There was no shame in visiting a lupanar. Roman men weren't expected to be monogamous, just discreet enough not to offend their wife's family. A trip to the brothel was as ordinary as stopping at the bakery, though arguably more expensive and slightly more complicated to explain to your children. What was shameful, however, was working in a lupanar. Prostitutes were considered infames, a legal category that included gladiators, actors, and other people who earned a living through their bodies. They had no legal standing, no protection, no path to respectability. They couldn't testify in court or inherit property. Their labor was vital, taxed, and deeply stigmatized. You pause beside a worn inscription. I, Lucius, spent 2 denarii and it was worth it. It's both a review and a declaration carved forever into the volcanic plaster. You wonder about Lucius, what he expected, what he found, whether he ever came back. There's a story, half history, half legend, about a Roman girl named Marcia who worked in a lupanar but saved enough to buy her freedom. She later donated a public fountain to her neighborhood. It bore her name, proudly. The city accepted her gift, but they quietly chipped away the word libertà, freed woman, from the inscription. They wanted her water, not her past, and the workers themselves. Some were enslaved, many were imported from the provinces, Greece, Gaul, Syria. Others were debt slaves or abandoned children raised for the trade. A few entered willingly, though willing in a Roman context usually meant slightly less coerced than the others. Their names were often stripped from them, replaced with aliases like Cressa, Cypris, or Flora, names of goddesses and flowers, both alluring and anonymous. One quirky tidbit, some lupanars offered loyalty programs, really. A sort of punch card system scratched into clay tablets. 10 visits, 1 free. There's something grimly comical about imagining a Roman citizen jingling down a dusty alley, clutching his 10th stamp and muttering, "Finally, a free one." And then there were the Celle Meretriciae, smaller, individual rental rooms scattered throughout the city. These were often located above taverns or near public baths. They weren't full brothels, just single rooms rented by the hour. The original Airbnb, but with fewer linens and a much higher chance of graffiti. Speaking of which, you glance at another scribble by the entrance. Gaius gave 2 sesterces and regretted it. Not all experiences were 5-star. One has to imagine the TripAdvisor reviews would have been colourful. But amid the jokes and commerce, something softer lingers here. You wonder what these walls heard. Moments, not of transaction, but of confession. Maybe someone cried here, maybe someone laughed for the first time in weeks, maybe a soldier whispered his real name, maybe a woman touched someone's face just once with something like care. Historians rarely write about that part. As you step back into the light, you notice the fascinum again, dangling above the doorframe, as if to bless both the entrance and the exit. It spins gently in the breeze, its little wings fluttering like a warning or a wink. You take one last look at the frescoes, still vivid, still watching, and realize something important. Rome didn't hide its brothels in shame. It built them into the city's heartbeat. They weren't secret, they were just silenced. Let the light filter through the dust, let the footsteps fade, and let your mind rest in the knowledge that even in a world ruled by hierarchy and hard edges, there were still places, however narrow, however fleeting, where people met, touched, and disappeared into each other, if only for a moment. Night deepens now over the rooftops of Rome, stars blinking faintly above tiled eaves and coiling smoke. But even in darkness, some homes shine with eerie excess, floating pleasure palaces, perfumed banquet halls, and candlelit corridors of unchecked indulgence. You're entering the world of emperors now, and when it came to sex and power, no one indulged like the Caesars. You begin with the most infamous of them all, Caligula, a name that sends a shiver even through marble. Born Gaius Julius Caesar, Germanicus, he earned the nickname Caligula, the little boots. From childhood days, spent trailing after soldiers. He grew up inside the machinery of empire, and by the time he took the purple robe, he didn't just inherit an empire, he believed he was a god. And what does a god do? Whatever he wants. Caligula turned imperial bedrooms into theatres of dominance. He was said to have taken wives from senators at dinner parties, slept with them, then offered a review over wine. She was noisy, he reportedly joked once, raising his goblet. Senators laughed, too hard, too nervously. Historians still debate the truth of these tales, especially since much of Caligula's history was written post-mortem by people who deeply hated him. Still, the smoke suggests fire, and what fire it was. He built floating pleasure barges on Lake Nemi, massive, opulent ships outfitted with gardens, temples, plumbing, and Reportedly, entire brothels staffed by enslaved men and women. Picture a party that floats. Picture the emperor sailing from decadence to decadence, trailed by music, incense, and people who couldn't say no. If the stories are true, even Dionysus would have blushed. And then there's Nero, the emperor, whose private life makes Caligula seem like a prude. He didn't just dominate, he dramatized. Nero staged entire public weddings to his male lovers, first to a freedman named Pythagoras, with Nero as the bride, and later to a beautiful youth named Sporus, with Nero as the groom. Sporus was reportedly castrated, dressed in the robes of a Roman empress, and paraded around like royalty. You might be tempted to find that romantic. Don't. The power imbalance was total. Sporus didn't choose any of it. And yet, oddly, Nero seemed genuinely fond of him. When the emperor died by suicide, he reportedly whispered, "What an artist dies in me," but also asked that Sporus be buried with imperial honors, as if apology could retroactively fix the harm. Nero also constructed the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, his pleasure palace after the Great Fire of Rome. It stretched across hundreds of acres with rotating dining rooms, gemstone ceilings, and walls that smelled of saffron and rose. You read that correctly, the walls smelled. This was architecture as seduction. And in the center of it all, Nero reclining in silk, watching dancers and acrobats while petting a leopard. Probably, one quirky tidbit, the Domus Aurea included a room with a ceiling that rotated like the heavens, showering guests with petals and perfume. Sounds dreamy, unless, as one source notes, you were allergic to roses or not fond of things falling in your soup. The key to understanding imperial intimacy is this: it was performative. Emperors used sex not as private pleasure but public spectacle. They blurred lines between god, actor, and man. They slept with whom they wanted, not just because they desired them, but because doing so proved they could. And everyone else? They played along, or they disappeared. Even the cleaner emperors weren't exempt. Hadrian, famous for his wall building and beard growing, was deeply attached to a young Greek man named Antinous. Their relationship has been romanticized through the centuries, and there was genuine affection, but it still existed inside the Roman hierarchy. When Antinous drowned in the Nile under mysterious circumstances, Hadrian didn't just mourn, he deified him, built statues, named cities, founded a cult. Imagine loving someone so much you turn them into a god and then make everyone else worship him too. Still, Hadrian's grief rings with something real, even now. And that's what complicates everything. Behind the domination, the theatre, the cruelty, sometimes there was longing, even love, but always shaped by power. Love wasn't mutual, it was curated, and those who received it had no choice but to reflect it back. You pass now through an imperial corridor. The floor is glassy smooth. The walls gleam with precious inlay. A tiny silver lamp flickers in a recess, its flame trembling beside a carved relief of Venus and Mars entwined under a veil. You realize that the very gods of love in Rome mirrored this same imbalance. Mars dominates, Venus seduces, no one ever just loves quietly. Even the satirists couldn't resist mocking it all. Juvenal once wrote of an emperor who surrounded himself with actors and eunuchs, lovers and liars, living in a palace so soaked in lust it smelled like a lupanar. The palace guards weren't armed, they just carried lists of names. Who was invited in? Who was never allowed to leave? You step now into an open garden, what remains of the Domus Aurea's peristyle. The moon hangs low above the columns, the scent of crushed time drifts through the air. You imagine the ghosts of servants moving silently through the hedges, eyes downcast. You imagine Sporus in his empress robes, gazing up at the stars and wondering what life would have been like with a different emperor, or none at all. And just like that, the golden walls dissolve. Let the perfumed air settle. Let the dining room stop spinning. Let the marble lions sleep. And let your breath grow soft as the parade of emperors fades into quiet. You stroll now through a quieter district, the wind carrying whispers rather than shouts. past the forum, beyond the markets, into back streets paved with cracked cobblestones and humour carved straight into the walls. Here, history isn't in scrolls or Senate decrees, it's scrawled in the language of the people. Welcome to the crude, candid, and occasionally hysterical world of dirty Roman graffiti, the jokes they never taught in Latin class. Rome took itself very seriously. Marble statues, legal speeches, moral codes carved in stone. But her people? Not always. Walk through the preserved streets of Pompeii or Herculaneum, and you'll find walls covered in messages so informal, so chaotic, so gloriously petty, that they feel eerily modern. You pause at one now. A Timidus got me pregnant. No preamble, no last name, just a permanent paternity claim scratched into stucco. Beside it, someone has replied in a different hand. A Timidus couldn't get a fig tree pregnant. Roman clapback culture, alive and well. Much of this graffiti revolved around sex, who was good, who was bad, and who would regret not calling back. One classic from a tavern wall. We have wet girls here, take your pick. A second voice adds, beware of Claudia, she steals tunics. Some inscriptions even read like Yelp reviews. I had a good time. Marcia is skilled. Avoid thermia. All mouth, no motion. And while, yes, these messages are crude, they're also deeply human. They show us a Rome that was cheeky, flawed, and alive. A city where people laughed at their own desires, mocked each other's failures, and used walls like a Twitter thread, except with more fallacies. Ah, yes, the fallacies. They're everywhere. On tavern signs, in house mosaics, even pointing the way to brothels like an ancient anatomical GPS. Scholars call it apotropaic magic, images meant to ward off evil. But sometimes it was just comedy. A drawing of a man tripping over his own proportions still scratches the same adolescent itch it did 2,000 years ago. One particularly enthusiastic artist even etched, Secundus likes it up the... Well, let's just say we'll redact the rest. But his friend helpfully added beneath it, so does your mother. Somewhere even Cicero is rolling his eyes. Yet this graffiti wasn't just boys being boys. Women wrote it too. Some inscriptions show female names expressing affection, desire, or straight-up sass. I love the man who can read this. Subtle, flirty, bilingual if you're lucky. And some women just got practical. Fortunata made 10 denarii here today. Beat that, Julia. Part earnings report, part humblebrag. Historians still debate how public some of these walls were. Were these backroom jokes, open-air announcements? It's unclear. But the volume and variety suggest that Roman society tolerated a kind of graffiti culture, especially in cities like Pompeii, where the walls were as busy as the streets. You pass now under a vine-draped archway and enter what was once a thermopolium, a Roman fast food stall. The counter is scorched with age, but above it someone has scratched, "I screwed the cook, the food was cold." A dual review, culinary and carnal. Gordon Ramsay, eat your heart out. And yet amid the humour there's something deeper. These wall carvings are some of the only surviving voices of ordinary Romans. Not senators or generals, but bakers, slaves, soldiers, and lovers. People who would never make it into marble, but still wanted to be remembered, even if just as a dirty joke. One fringe discovery: in the gladiator barracks of Pompeii, someone scrawled, "Celadus the Thracian is the girl's delight." It's carved with flair, deep, bold, confident. Was it self-promotion, a fan, a rival mocking him with a wink? We'll never know. Well, but it's strangely sweet. The idea that someone wanted the world to know they were wanted. And then the rarest type of graffiti, longing. You find one now, faded almost to dust. It reads, "If only you had stayed." No signature, no answer, just a whisper. Because for all their bravado, the Romans still hurt, still missed each other, still scratched aching hearts into stone when parchment felt too formal. You linger a while longer, watching shadows stretch over the messages. They seem to pulse with life, with wit, pettiness, craving, with all the glorious absurdity of being human in a city built on order but fueled by chaos. So let the voices of the streets lull you now, let the insults soften, let the carved laughter echo just once more before it fades into moonlight and moss. You wander now toward a steamy haze, rising from low domes of brick and tile, Rome's great bathhouses, the thermae, where marble meets moisture and dignity often evaporates with the steam. You pass through archways where togas are abandoned, where oil and sweat mingle, and where politics, philosophy, and flirtation float together like vapor. Because here, in this hot, echoing sanctuary, even the sternest Roman might blush, or boast. The baths were Rome's social equalizer. Rich or poor, citizen or slave on their master's coin, most Romans bathed, not in the sense of quiet hygiene, but in full theatrical immersion. Picture vast marble halls, walls painted with gods and satyrs, ceilings dripping with condensation, pools of various temperatures gurgled, frigidarium for the cold, tepidarium for the warm, and caldarium for the blisteringly hot. It was less a bath and more a ritual, and no one bathed alone. You enter the apoditerium, the changing room, where attendants watch your sandals and cloak. One of them eyes you knowingly, he's seen everything. This is where first glances are exchanged. This is where a young man might catch the eye of a seasoned senator, or where a woman, on rare designated days, might scan the benches for someone interesting. The baths weren't just for washing, they were for watching. The strigil, a curved metal scraper, was the tool of choice here. No soap, just oil, applied liberally, then scraped off with the sweat and grime. And occasionally, dignity. Massages were available too, performed by young slaves trained to knead tired limbs and, sometimes, other things, depending on who was paying and how much they were tipping. One quirky detail. Romans believed that the oil scrapings, called smegma, not to be confused with the modern medical term, had healing properties. Some collected it in jars and sold it as a cure-all. So yes, someone in the forum may have paid good coin for another man's back sweat. Historians still argue whether that was science or scam, probably both. But the real heat wasn't in the water, it was in the conversation. The bathhouse was a place to talk, loudly, politics, gossip, lawsuits, poetry. If you had a scandal to spread or a rival to insult, do it by the caldarium. The steam made it harder for others to tell who was speaking. Perfect conditions for anonymous shade. And sometimes the conversation turned suggestive. Philosophers like Socrates were said to frequent bathhouses not just for cleanliness but for discourse. His student Alcibiades once joked that they learned more about virtue in the steam than at the academy. And if someone happened to be reclining nearby in an attractive pose, well, let's call that educational material. One bathhouse inscription reads, "Here, Minerva washes but Venus watches," a clever little nod to the fact that even goddesses might raise a brow at what happened between the tiles. The male gaze ran rampant. Young boys, ephebes, were often objectified, especially by older men. Wall art, preserved in the ashes of Pompeii, shows bathhouse scenes that would never make it into school textbooks. Some flirted, some propositioned, some watched in silence. This wasn't hidden, it was simply accepted. Rome's definition of decorum didn't always match ours. That said, not everyone approved. Some moralists were scandalized by bathhouse behavior. Seneca the Younger once lamented the bellowing, splashing, and grunting of the bath crowds, which he claimed made it impossible to think. But knowing Seneca, he was probably more annoyed about someone stealing his sandals. Women, for the most part, had separate bathing times or entirely different facilities. Modesty rules were stricter, though not always followed. Wealthy women sometimes bathed in private villas, surrounded by their own attendants. But on festival days the lines blurred, and occasionally so did the dress codes. Roman poets weren't shy about bathhouse flings. Martial, ever the snide observer, once wrote about a man who visited the baths just to ogle and proposition, and only bathed as a last resort. One of his verses snipes, "You sweat before you soak, Gellius, you chase before you cleanse." Ah, poetry. Yet the bathhouse wasn't only a haven for pleasure, it was a stage for performance. The body became both audience and actor. Strong muscles signaled discipline. A youthful appearance suggested moral virtue. A flabby stomach or bad skin, obvious signs of moral decay, or too much wine. And this obsession with appearance led to a surprising amount of body-shaming graffiti. On one bathhouse wall, "Beware of Gaius, his arms are strong but his brain is weak." On another, "Lucia, you laugh too loudly, it shakes the tiles." Even in steam, self-consciousness lingered like fog. But occasionally, amid the ogling and the judging and the leering, something softer emerged. Friendships, rivalries turned into camaraderie. A shared moment beneath the same drip of condensation. Two strangers who helped each other balance on slippery steps. A wink exchanged, not for domination, but for amusement. You now wander past the final pool, its waters still warm. Steam curls around you like a blanket. The room is nearly empty, just the echo of past conversations, the slap of sandal against wet tile, the whisper of oil on skin. Let the mist wrap around you now. Let the voices blur. Let the marble grow soft at the edges. In a place where bodies were bare, but motives rarely were, allow yourself a moment of weightless quiet, where even Rome pauses to breathe. You step now from the marble silence of the baths into the flickering glow of lamplight and ink, into the realm of poets, those sly, scandalous wordsmiths who turned Roman intimacy into verse. Their names drift like smoke through time: Ovid, Catullus, Martial. And though their meters are ancient, their mischief is eternal. The poets knew something everyone else only whispered. Words could seduce just as well as touch. You begin with Catullus, who burned bright and short, like a scandalous candle in a quiet temple. His love poems to Lesbia, his not-so-secret code name for a married woman named Clodia, were raw, breathless, and occasionally petty. He wrote of kisses, thousands of them, counted like coins. "Give me 1,000, then 100, then another 1,000. It sounds romantic. Until the next poem, where he curses her for infidelity and calls her a woman of the crossroads, or a witch in Roman slang, wasn't about geography. Catullus was never shy. He named names. He joked about anatomy. He oscillated between adoration and bile, like a man very much not over his ex. And somehow we have nearly all of it preserved, little scrolls of heartbreak and ego stuffed into the literary drawers of history. Then there's Ovid, the smooth-tongued emperor of elegance. If Catullus was the passionate drunk at the party, Ovid was the slick host pouring wine and making eye contact with everyone's wife. His Ars Amatoria, the art of love, was a full-on how-to guide for seduction in Rome. It covered where to meet people, circus, theatre, what to say, nothing too eager, and what to wear, clean tunics, obviously. It even included advice on how to fake a sneeze to start a conversation. Very subtle, one of his famous tips. Make her jealous, write her name on a rival's wall. Toxic. A little. Effective. Ovid thought so. But his poetry had consequences. Augustus, that buzzkill of moral reform, banished Ovid to the edge of the empire, citing a poem and a mistake. Most assume the poem was Ars Amatoria. As for the mistake, no one knows. Historians still argue whether he witnessed something he shouldn't have, perhaps an imperial affair, and got exiled not for poetry but proximity. Either way, poor Ovid spent his final years shivering on the Black Sea, writing letters to Rome like a lovesick teenager, grounded for eternity. Then there's Martial, the king of the Roman roast. His poems were short, sharp, and often scandalous. He didn't just describe Roman sexuality, he weaponized it. You say you're pure gala, but you sleep on purple sheets and bathe in milk. You fool no one. He had verses for everyone: senators, prostitutes, lovers, rivals. Some poems were love notes, others were verbal pie-throwing contests. But through it all, he sketched a portrait of a city where desire and reputation constantly wrestled. One particularly cheeky poem reads, "I'd rather kiss your mirror than your mouth. It's cleaner." Poetry as public service announcement. But perhaps the most fascinating part. These poets didn't just write about sex, they shaped how Romans thought about it. Their words painted desire as performance, pleasure as politics, love as battlefield. And they blurred every line between affection and obsession, between honesty and exaggeration, between memory and myth. You pass now through a shaded portico where fragments of verse are etched in the stone, half faded like whispers through fog. I loved her, I left her, I dream of her. Was it real? Was it copied from a scroll, or just another Roman struck dumb by lust and trying to sound profound? And let's not forget the double meanings. Latin is wonderfully compact and Roman poets adored wordplay. The verb ire means to go, but in certain verses it meant other forms of movement. The word bellus meant pretty, but depending on inflection could carry a wink. And when poets talked about ploughing the fields, well, the Romans were not known for their agricultural metaphors. One fringe tidbit: a few erotic poems survived because monks copied them by accident, mistaking them for philosophical texts. Somewhere in a medieval scriptorium, a poor scribe probably turned very red when he hit line 4, and yet even in their naughtiest moments, Roman poets were never just dirty. Their verses held loneliness, longing, ego, delight. A man might write about a woman's perfume, then spiral into a meditation on mortality. A line about ankles might become an elegy for a lost summer. The bedroom for them was both setting and symbol. It stood for everything Rome craved: control, connection, chaos. You settle now beside a small fountain, its trickle echoing beneath the vines. Above you, scratched into the wall, a line of Ovid: "Let others wage wars, you lucky Rome, make love." Was it sincere? Ironic? Both? The poets always knew that desire is history's secret handwriting. It lingers in margins, in verses, in sighs, caught between the lines. Let the ink fade, let the parchment rest, let your breath slow to the rhythm of borrowed meter, because even in a city of stone and sword, someone was always scribbling a love poem in the dark. You find yourself now in a quieter corner of the city, where scrolls pile high on wooden shelves, and magistrates furrow their brows over tiny Latin letters. Because as casual as Rome often seemed about pleasure and flirtation, beneath it all pulsed a deep, relentless engine of laws, loopholes, and penalties, especially when it came to sexual behavior. Make no mistake, Romans loved control. Not just over people, but over morality itself. And by the time Augustus became emperor, Rome didn't just build aqueducts and armies, it built a legal code to patrol bedrooms. That's right. You couldn't even have an affair without accidentally breaking 3 laws and endangering your family name. You brush your fingers over a wooden tablet. It's a replica of the Lex Julia de Adulteris Coetendis, Augustus's sweeping reform from 18 BCE. The name sounds impressive. The contents? A very fancy way of saying, if you cheat, we ruin your life. The law made adultery a public crime, not a private matter, not a scandal to be whispered about over grapes, but an offence against the state. Think about that. Your infidelity wasn't just your spouse's problem, it was Rome's problem. If a husband caught his wife in the act, he was expected to take action quickly. If he didn't, he himself could be prosecuted for tolerating immorality. In other words, don't be lenient was the law. Fathers could even kill a daughter and her lover if they were caught under his roof, though only under very specific conditions, and usually only if both were of respectable status. Comforting, no? Punishments ranged from exile to loss of property, to banishment to a miserable island, a fate that sounds poetic until you realize the island probably had bad plumbing and 0 fig trees. And what about the man caught with another man's wife? He too could be prosecuted unless he was of high enough status or managed to bribe the right people. Rome liked its laws, but it liked its exceptions even more. Still, there were some truly weird loopholes. For example, adultery laws only applied if the woman was married. If she was a prostitute, a concubine, or technically not respectable, then her lover faced no charges. Fidelity, it turns out, wasn't about morality, it was about property protection. A wife was expected to produce legitimate heirs. If those heirs were in doubt, the whole social order wobbled. Men, on the other hand, weren't held to quite the same standard. A married man could sleep with prostitutes or slaves without legal penalty. As long as he didn't seduce another man's wife or a freeborn virgin, he was probably in the clear. You see how this works? Historians still argue whether these laws were actually enforced or mostly performative, a kind of moral stagecraft to make Augustus seem like the father of a purified Rome. After all, this is the same man whose own daughter, Julia, was later exiled under the very adultery law he created. Her lovers? Banished. One even starved himself to death. Augustus reportedly never spoke her name again. Nothing like good old-fashioned parental hypocrisy baked into legal precedent. You step now into a small chamber where legal scribes once worked, sharp-eyed men with ink-stained fingers and too many opinions. They copied laws, wrote up marriage contracts, and notarized dues agreements, the dowry arrangements that essentially acted as prenups. These contracts could be brutally specific. She brings to the marriage 300 denarii, 1 silk tunic, and the promise to produce a son. No pressure. And speaking of dowries, if a woman committed adultery, her dowry could be seized by her husband. But if the husband cheated, the wife had no such claim, because Rome, as ever, applied rules like oil, generously and unevenly. There were also laws about betrothals, especially involving young girls. Betrothals could be legally binding even for children, as long as both families agreed. The actual marriage would come later, but if one side backed out prematurely, the offended party could sue for breach of promise. Imagine being 12 years old and already owing your future in-laws a legal explanation. One bizarre but real tidbit. The Lex Papia Poppaea, passed later under Augustus, imposed penalties for remaining single. That's right. If you didn't marry and produce children, you could lose the right to inherit property. Rome didn't just encourage family life, it threatened you into it. Widows were expected to remarry within 2 years, divorced women within 18 months. The state wanted heirs, soldiers, and tax-paying citizens. Love, personal choice, emotional recovery, all optional extras. And then there were the public registries. Roman men had to declare their number of children in official records, especially if they wanted political advancement. A man with 3 or more legitimate children received special privileges. A man with no children, he got side-eye from the Senate and probably fewer dinner invitations. But for all this legal posturing, Rome remained full of contradictions. Enslaved people had no marriage rights, but their unions were often respected by custom. Women couldn't vote or hold office, but they managed households, ran businesses, even influenced senators behind closed curtains. And while Augustus tried to legislate morality, his successors, well, you've already met Nero and Caligula, let's just say they didn't read the fine print. You pause by an old stone bench outside the office. The wall behind you bears a faint chisel mark. Love laughs at laws. Was it written by a lawyer? A lover? Maybe both, because even in the city of order and rulebooks, desire always found its loophole. A secret glance, a disguised message, a marriage contract altered at the last minute. Let the scrolls rest now, let the ink dry, let the laws sleep in their cubbies, unread and gently cracking with age. For Rome may have tried to tame love, but love, as usual, refused to obey. You move now through a corridor lined with jars, glass, ceramic, even bronze, each once filled with something fragrant, strange, or alarming. You've wandered into Rome's answer to the medicine cabinet, but be warned, nothing here smells like lavender. Tonight we descend into the pungent, peculiar world of Roman fertility tricks and freakish remedies. Let's start with the basics. The Romans wanted babies, lots of them. Heirs, labourers, alliances in tiny tunics. But conception wasn't just left to chance. It was pursued with the same energy they gave to empire building, systematic, obsessive, and occasionally unhinged. Step into a midwife's room. The air is sharp with vinegar and smoke. On a nearby shelf sits a well-thumbed copy of Soranus's Gynecology, a respected medical text of the time. It recommends moderate exercise, warm baths, and avoiding strong emotions. Sounds reasonable. Then you turn the page and discover that sneezing immediately after intercourse is a recommended contraceptive. No further instruction, just sneeze hard. Still, this was one of the more polite suggestions. Other ancient remedies were less charming. Want to prevent pregnancy? Pliny the Elder, always a reliable source of questionable wisdom, suggested a paste made from crushed ants, deer marrow, and weasel urine. Apply liberally and hope for the best. And yes, crocodile dung was a real thing. Mixed with honey and inserted as a pessary, it was believed to form a barrier. Scholars suspect the logic was more symbolic than scientific. Somehow the animal's reputation for ferocity got translated into birth control. One historian dryly noted that at the very least it killed the mood. For those trying to enhance fertility, the options were no less imaginative. Goat's milk, soaked dates, and powdered rose petals made frequent appearances, as did rabbit testicles dried, ground, and swallowed. Not because they contained hormones, mind you, but because rabbits were famously fertile. Roman medicine loved a good metaphor. Want twins? Rub your belly with a double-yolked egg. Want a boy? Sleep on your right side and avoid beans. A girl? Left side and mint tea. Want to influence the baby's personality? Conceive at midnight while chanting the name of a favorite ancestor. For a future philosopher, sprinkle sage on your bed sheets. And then there was the matter of aphrodisiacs. Roman couples, particularly those in arranged marriages, often needed a little help in the desire department. Enter oysters, honeyed wine, figs, and asparagus. Yes, asparagus. Romans believed its phallic shape gave it certain persuasive powers. You'd think the smell would cancel that out, but apparently not. And if your beloved remained unmoved, there was always rocket, a bitter herb, rumoured to stir the loins and unleash the winds. Interpret that as you wish. You brush past a table strewn with medical tools, forceps, bone saws, ceramic cups used for cupping therapy. One is still stained with what looks like red ochre, or possibly something less artistic. The Romans weren't squeamish, but they were deeply superstitious. Illness was often blamed on imbalanced humours or divine punishment, and treatments were a mash-up of logic and law. One genuinely useful Roman remedy, silphium, a plant from modern-day Libya. It was used for everything from cramps to contraception and became so valuable it was stamped on coins. The problem? It couldn't be cultivated. People over-harvested it into extinction. No more silphium, no more Roman birth control coin. Even Roman cosmetics bled into the fertility conversation. A woman with pale skin and bright cheeks was seen as healthy, thus fertile. So out came the lead-based foundation and red cinnabar blush. Yes, they looked good. No, they did not live long. Beauty truly was pain. And sometimes fertility wasn't about what you ate or smeared on your body. It was about rituals. On festival days, women ran through the streets, brushing passers-by with goat-hide whips during the festival of Lupercalia. It was believed the lash bestowed fertility. You're just trying to buy bread, and boom, instant family planning via leather. There were amulets too, tiny carvings of babies, wombs, and Venus herself, worn around the neck or tied to bedposts. Some women whispered charms before intimacy. Others visited oracles, and in extreme cases they visited quacks who promised results for a price and perhaps a little powdered lizard. One fringe tidbit: Romans believed that holding a frog in your mouth during intercourse could guarantee pregnancy. We don't recommend it. Neither did the frog. Of course, not everyone in Rome wanted children. Some women, especially entertainers or sex workers, had their own birth control tricks. In addition to herbal methods, they sometimes used animal bladders or wool tampons soaked in oil or vinegar, functioning as crude barriers. It wasn't ideal, but in a society that denied them control over much else, even small acts of agency mattered. You pause beside a midwife's bench, worn smooth from years of labour and hope. This is where women screamed, cried, laughed, and bled. where remedies were tested, where futures were made or lost. Because behind every bizarre recipe and dubious cure, there was real desperation to conceive, to not conceive, to survive. In a world where women were judged by their wombs, fertility wasn't just biology, it was identity, legacy, safety, or ruin. You step outside now, the air fresh and clear, after so many jars and vials. The stars above look the same as they did to a young wife in a Roman villa whispering to Venus for a child, or to a courtesan tying herbs under her pillow and praying for silence. Let the smells fade, let the scrolls close, let the ancient frog go free, and let your breath even out as you drift gently past the apothecaries of Rome, who promised life, though never gently, and never without a price. You emerge now into sunlight, soft, warm, and a little too flattering, as you step into the colonnaded courtyard of a Roman gymnasium. Bronze mirrors glint in the corners, olive oil shimmers in jars, and young men stretch their limbs with theatrical effort. Welcome to the glistening, competitive, and surprisingly political world of Roman male beauty standards. It may surprise you, but in a society obsessed with power, the male body wasn't simply meant to exist. It was supposed to signal dominance, not through brute bulk or flashy glamour, but through control, youthfulness, and above all, smoothness. That's right, hairlessness. Roman men, at least the fashionable ones, were expected to be sleek, not like bodybuilders, more like statues. Think soft abdominal lines, gentle curves, not a single chest hair out of place. If you were covered in thick hair like a Greek philosopher or a wild Gaul, you might be respected for your wisdom or your battle scars, but don't expect flirty glances at the forum. Smooth skin meant refinement, self-mastery, and probably a well-paid body slave with a pumice stone. You wander past a man bent awkwardly over a bronze basin as his attendant scrapes his legs with a novacula, a small, curved razor, not for the face, for the rest. Back, arms, chest, thighs, wherever fuzz dared grow, the Romans hunted it down. Pumice was used too, especially volcanic ash from regions like Campania, gritty, painful, effective. And those who didn't keep up, they were mocked. Martial, the ever-scathing poet, once described a man as a hairy patch, sewn to a tunic. Ovid recommended using tweezers if necessary. Yes, tweezers, the first-century solution for a hot date. This emphasis on grooming extended to scent. Roman men wore perfume, but nothing too flowery, spikenard, myrrh, or a bit of imported cinnamon oil dabbed behind the ears. Smelling like a spice rack was fine. Smelling like a brothel? Social suicide. And what about muscles? Sure, strength mattered. Gladiators were admired, but they were also seen as entertainers, not aristocrats. The ideal Roman male figure wasn't bulky, it was balanced, toned, but not threatening. Showy biceps were suspect. You didn't want to look like you wrestled bulls unless you had a statue proving it. You move now toward a row of bronze mirrors leaned against a tiled wall. These weren't for vanity, they were tools. Roman men studied their reflections carefully, just as they studied rhetoric or law. The position of a fold in the toga, the angle of the hairline, the shadow beneath the jaw. Everything mattered. Speaking of hair, neat cropped curls were in. Wild, unkempt locks suggested Greek laziness or barbarian roots. Julius Caesar was so self-conscious about his receding hairline that he wore his laurel wreath constantly, indoors, outdoors, probably even to bed. Historians still argue whether it was habit, hubris, or just a really committed cover-up. And if Caesar could obsess, everyone else followed suit. Dyes were available, usually black or dark red, but risky. Apply too much and your head might look like a wine stain. Not ideal when delivering a speech about virtue. Beards, by the way, were a philosophical statement. If you were young and clean-shaven, you were fashionable. If you had a beard, you were signaling stoicism, wisdom, or perhaps just mourning the loss of a good razor. The Emperor Hadrian brought beards back into fashion after centuries of smooth-chinned dominance, but most senators still looked at facial hair with suspicion. What are you hiding in there, Decimus? One fringe fact, wealthy Roman men sometimes rubbed crushed pearls into their skin to soften it. Yes, pearls, real ones. Cleopatra supposedly did the same. The line between beauty and bankruptcy was surprisingly thin, but beauty wasn't just surface, it was tied to morality. A well-groomed man was believed to be a well-ordered man. If your sandals were scuffed or your toga askew, people assumed your thoughts were too. A crooked belt meant a crooked soul, which seems extreme until you remember that Roman senators would be mocked in graffiti for having flabby thighs. The public watched everything, and yet there was danger in being too beautiful. If your features were too delicate, your voice too soft, your movements too fluid, you risked being called effeminate, or worse, a cinedas. Not just an insult, but a social death sentence. The fine line between elegant and excessive kept many Roman men in a constant state of anxiety. Look refined but not dainty, be proud but not pretty. It's like trying to win a chariot race while adjusting your tunic with one hand. And for young boys, the pressure was doubled. Boys were considered at their peak beauty between the ages of 12 and 18. Artists, poets, and powerful men fixated on this idealized stage of youth. Paintings showed them lounging with perfect curls, soft limbs, and coy glances. Uncomfortable? Yes, but disturbingly normalized in Roman high society. Still, not every Roman man conformed. Farmers didn't shave. Soldiers didn't exfoliate. Philosophers let their cloaks wrinkle and their sandals squeak. The city might worship smoothness, but the countryside, the legions, the dusty villas, they kept things rougher, realer. You pass now into a small courtyard where a young man practices rhetorical gestures before an invisible audience. His stance is wide, his chin up, his robe arranged just so. He's not training his voice, he's sculpting his image. Because in Rome, to be looked at was to be judged, and to be judged favorably, that was half the victory. Let the mirrors blur now, let the strigils rest, let the soft scrape of pumice fade into the background, because behind every smooth chest and plucked eyebrow was a man trying to survive in a city where beauty was power, and power, always, was performance. The hallway grows darker now, cooler, narrower. You pass beneath an archway into a private atrium, its walls echoing with a hush that feels deliberate. Because this is where bodies weren't admired or oiled or celebrated. This is where they were owned. Welcome to the brutal, unspoken reality of women's bodies as property in ancient Rome. You're standing in a household ruled by the paterfamilias, the male head of the family. His word is law, literally. Roman law gave him absolute authority over everyone in his household, wife, children, slaves, even grown sons. And at the center of this structure sat women, particularly daughters and wives, who were often treated not as people but as assets. Let's start with the daughter. From birth, she was a negotiation in progress. Her name wasn't even uniquely hers. Roman women were usually named after the clan they were born into. So if you were born into the Julian family, your name might simply be Julia. Your sisters, Julia Secunda, Julia Tertia, and so on. Imagine growing up and realizing your name is basically Julia number 3. That was your identity, an extension of someone else's lineage. And once you reached marriageable age, which could be as young as 12, your body became a transaction. Fathers arranged marriages for alliances, dowries, or prestige. Love? Irrelevant. A daughter could be betrothed without her consent, handed over like a carefully wrapped scroll. The dowry followed her, of course, money, property, slaves, even jewelry. But it wasn't hers, it was a cushion for her husband's household, something to ensure she was worth the trouble. If she failed to bear children, or worse, became difficult, he could divorce her and return the dowry like a used amphora, or keep it, depending on the fine print. And if she cheated, that dowry became forfeit. But if he cheated, well, as we've already seen, Rome just sort of shrugged and moved on. Once married, a woman's body became even more restricted. Her role? To produce legitimate heirs. Her sexuality? Monitored. Her freedom? Limited. In many households, she couldn't leave the house without permission. Her letters could be read, her visits observed, And while not all marriages were prison cells, some had warmth, even love, the system never assumed she had autonomy, only utility. Even her appearance was controlled. Respectable women were expected to wear the stola, a long, modest garment that signaled chastity and status. Her hair was to be neat, her gestures reserved. Too much makeup? Suspicious. Too many jewels? Vain. Too much voice? Dangerous. Marshall once wrote, "Chloe, your eyeliner speaks louder than your husband." It was not a compliment. Yet despite all this, Roman women found ways to exert influence, clever, quiet, and often through the very systems meant to confine them. A wife might manage her husband's business in his absence. She might whisper into the ears of senators during dinner. She might arrange matches between families, wielding her social network like a dagger in a silk glove. One striking example, Livia Drusilla, wife of Augustus. She never held office, never delivered speeches, but she was widely considered the power behind the throne, clever, calculating, deeply involved in imperial affairs. Some even whispered that she poisoned rivals to secure her son Tiberius's path to emperor. Truth or slander, historians still argue, but no one doubts her influence. Even enslaved women, those with the fewest rights of all, found ways to carve space within the system. Some became personal attendants to elite Roman women, trusted with secrets and schedules. Others were wet nurses, midwives, or entertainers. Their bodies were not their own, but sometimes their minds were sharp enough to survive. A few eventually earned their freedom. A rare few rose to wealth. One poignant tidbit: on a tombstone in Rome, a freed woman named Aurelia Philometia had this carved: "Once a slave, now beloved wife." Not by force, but by freedom. It's a rare note of hope in a system built on ownership. And even in death, a woman's body could be evaluated. Epitaphs praised women for being chaste, obedient, unseen outside the home. The highest compliment: she stayed inside. It sounds like a weather report, but in Roman society, a woman who rarely left her home was viewed as virtuous. Modesty, inaction, silence, those were the virtues that outlived you. Yet, some women wrote their own epitaphs, some paid for their own tombs, some funded temples, ran estates, raised brilliant children, and dared to be remembered as something more than a womb in a toga. You pause now in the peristyle, the garden at the centre of a Roman home. The vines are overgrown, the fountain is still. You imagine the women who walked here, morning light on their hair, sandals soft against the stone. You wonder what they whispered to themselves when no one was listening. Because for all the statues of generals and emperors, for all the laws written by men in ivory halls, the truth of Rome lives just as much in the quiet strength of the women who bore it forward. Uncelebrated, unnamed, unfree, but unbroken. Let the fountain ripple. Let the silence stretch. Let your breath slow as you pass through a world where bodies were currency, but where spirit always found its own quiet rebellion. The air is heavier now, the kind of stillness that clings just before a summer storm. You step over a low threshold, through a narrow wooden door. No grand marble this time, no frescoes, no columns. This is not a room for show. This is a bedroom, but in Rome, even here, the most private space was never truly personal. Because for the Romans, the bed wasn't about comfort, it was about conquest. Let's be clear, in Roman culture, sex was war, and the bedroom, its battlefield. Whether in a marriage chamber, a brothel cell, or a villa's guest room, the Roman bed was a place where hierarchies hardened. Every act, every position, every moan or lack of one mapped onto questions of class, status, control. You didn't make love in Rome, you asserted something, if not about yourself, then over someone else. Imagine reclining beside a sleeping partner. You'd think they were relaxed. But in Roman eyes, the one lying still was passive. And if they were male? That passivity translated to shame. Remember, submission, especially for freeborn men, wasn't just frowned upon, it was seen as a moral failing, a collapse of Roman virtue. So men were expected to be active, aggressive, initiating. They weren't required to ask what the other person wanted just to establish control. The ideal Roman man wasn't a romantic, he was a strategist, even in bed. And women? Well, their experience was carefully curated to remain ambiguous. Roman literature rarely describes female pleasure, unless it's to mock it. A woman who enjoyed sex too much was dangerous, hysterical, possibly unfaithful. A wife who lay silent and cold, that was expected, praised even. The less she responded, the more virtuous she appeared. And if she did show passion, she risked being compared to Messalina, the infamous wife of Emperor Claudius. Roman gossip claimed she snuck out of the palace at night to work at a brothel and competed with prostitutes for how many clients she could take in one night. A likely exaggeration, but Rome loved a good scandal, and Messalina became the cautionary tale. Too beautiful, too sexual, too powerful. She was eventually executed. Her reputation never rehabilitated. The point was clear. Women in Rome could participate in sex, but not too much. They could feel desire, but not act on it. They could be beautiful, but not seductive, unless it served someone else's politics. And slaves? They didn't even get to be participants. They were instruments. No consent, no courtship, just obligation. Their pleasure, their comfort, their opinion, irrelevant. Some were trained to serve in the bedroom, groomed to read the needs of their owners, or simply made available whenever demanded. These weren't affairs. They were assignments. One fringe, but telling fact. Certain households even had special beds for guests, known colloquially as lovers' couches. These weren't for sleeping, they were for hospitality. If you were important enough, the host might offer a courtesan, a companion, or a particularly trained slave to keep you company. The Romans called it elegant generosity. Today we might call it something else. Even language betrayed the battlefield. The Latin term coitus simply means a coming together. But Romans preferred verbs like subigere, to subdue, or imperare, to command. The metaphors weren't romantic, they were military. You glance now at a mosaic in a corner room, tiny tiles forming two figures mid-act. The man looks triumphant, one hand raised, the woman reclining below, eyes closed. But something's off. Her other hand reaches quietly for a necklace, a gesture, a distraction, a small, silent rebellion in a space where none was allowed. Because for some Romans, particularly women, pleasure wasn't found in dominance, but in resistance. The wife who fell ill every time her husband visited her room. The courtesan who accidentally spilled oil on an overly eager client. The guest who turned down the offered companion with a polite but pointed joke. Resistance took many forms, subtle ones, whispered ones, even literature hints at it. In Ovid's Metamorphoses, stories of pursuit and flight dominate. Nymphs chased by gods, maidens turned into trees or rivers to escape desire. These aren't love stories, they're struggles over agency, written in the language of myth to shield the pain beneath. And yet, not all beds were battlegrounds. Some couples found genuine affection, even tenderness. We know this because of a few surviving epitaphs. One man, mourning his wife, wrote, "In our bed we spoke not of conquest but of comfort. She slept with her hand in mine." Was it typical? No, but it reminds us that even in a system built on power, moments of humanity flickered through. You step away now, leaving the bed behind. The sheets are cool, the candles nearly spent. A breeze slips through the open shutters, softening the sharp corners of the night. Let the conflict ease, let the assertions fade, let the heavy language of domination melt into silence. Because even in Rome, even amid its marble and iron, there were spaces where conquest gave way to stillness, and stillness gave way to sleep. The villa seems to breathe again as you step outside, night fully fallen now, shadows stretching long across the flagstones. But overhead, the gods are still watching. Or so the Romans believed, because in their world, the divine didn't stay in the heavens. The gods watched, whispered, punished, and sometimes participated, especially when it came to matters of the bedroom. Welcome to the strangely voyeuristic, awkwardly personal world of gods who piqued and punished. Start with Venus, naturally. The goddess of love, beauty, fertility, she was everywhere. Statues, temples, brooches, even bathhouse walls. Every Roman knew her face, her pose, her smirk. She was the celestial approval stamp on romantic desire. But she wasn't gentle. She wasn't even loyal. Her love life included Mars, Mercury, Anchises, and allegedly the occasional mortal shepherd who caught her eye. And when mortals invoked her name in prayer, they weren't always asking for roses and kisses. Sometimes they were just asking to get lucky. One popular household ritual involved offering Venus a comb, a necklace, or a small carved figure left beside the bed as a kind of divine nudge. "Watch over us tonight," it said, but not too closely. Because the gods didn't just bless intimacy. Sometimes they meddled. Take Diana, goddess of the hunt and protector of chastity. One myth tells of Actaeon, a mortal hunter who stumbled upon her while she bathed in a sacred spring. He didn't speak. He didn't move, but he looked, and that was enough. Diana, furious at the intrusion, turned him into a stag, and his own hounds tore him apart. Lesson? Don't stare at bathing goddesses. Rome had a thing about privacy, even divine privacy. But then there was Jupiter, the original celestial troublemaker, king of the gods, husband of Juno, known for his, let's call it, aggressive enthusiasm. Jupiter didn't just seduce mortals, he transformed into animals to do it. A swan, a bull, even a golden rain, yes, really. Mortals who attracted his attention rarely got a happy ending. They got scandal, wrath, or weirdly specific offspring. And if Juno found out, well, expect divine vengeance, usually directed at the woman, because patriarchy doesn't stop at Olympus. And it wasn't just Jupiter. Apollo fell in love with the nymph Daphne, who wanted absolutely nothing to do with him. She begged her father, a river god, for help, and was transformed into a laurel tree mid-sprint. Apollo was heartbroken, of course, so he wore a laurel wreath forever after, as a tribute. Romantic, sort of, also weird. He essentially crowned himself with regret. The gods didn't just chase, they also punished, especially mortals who claimed to be better lovers or more beautiful. Arachne, a mortal woman, dared to say she could weave better tapestries than Minerva, goddess of wisdom. She didn't just beat the goddess, she depicted the god's sexual crimes on her tapestry. Bold move. Minerva turned her into a spider. And then there's Priapus, a minor god with a major presence. Statues of him were everywhere in gardens and doorways, grinning and indecent. He was supposed to ward off evil spirits, thieves, and possibly modesty itself. His statues were often deliberately exaggerated. Think of him as the ancient Roman neighborhood watch with no pants. Some households kept tiny terracotta figurines of Priapus near their beds, believing his oversized enthusiasm could protect against impotence and infidelity. One version of folk belief even claimed that mocking the statue, laughing at it, was part of the charm. Priapus was the punchline and the guardian. But not all gods interfered maliciously. Some offered strange but sincere comfort. Hercules, though a demigod, was often called upon for virility. Couples might hang a club or lion pelt in their bedroom, not for aesthetics, but as a sort of symbolic energy drink. One surviving inscription reads, to Hercules for strength 3 times nightly. Subtle. Even Cupid, tiny archer of chaos, wasn't as innocent as he looked. His arrows, gold for love, lead for loathing, were seen as real agents of fate. If you fell in love too suddenly, too irrationally, people didn't question your judgment. They just said, Cupid got you. The original blame it on the stars moment. One fringe tidbit. There's evidence that some Roman couples prayed to Pluto, god of the underworld, after a miscarriage or failed conception. Not for punishment, but for release. A quiet goodbye. Proof that even in a society obsessed with power, some moments were tender, and quietly the gods were invited in. You stand now in a garden shrine, lararium, where household gods, the Lares and Penates, watched over daily life. Small, painted, slightly smiling. They weren't grand or terrifying. They were personal. You might offer them wine, a bit of bread, or a whispered request, "Let us sleep well, let us be safe, let us be loved," because despite the voyeurism, the divine wrath, the uncomfortable myths, Romans still craved comfort, guidance, protection, and sometimes just a little peace under watchful celestial eyes. Let the gods rest now, let their statues blink into darkness, let their jealousies cool, and their arrows go unstrung. The heavens, like your thoughts, grow quieter with each breath. And beneath the stars, those same stars that once blinked over Jupiter and Juno, you close your eyes. Let the myth become mist. Let the legends settle into silence. The morning light has not yet returned, and you now find yourself walking along the edges of the forum, not the stately marble centre, but its shadowed sides. This is where rumours settle like dust, where reputations unravel faster than a toga in the wind, because in Rome a private act could spark a very public scandal, and no bedroom was ever truly sealed shut. Welcome to the sharp-tongued, ink-stained world of public shame and private scandals. You begin with a whisper, not yours, but someone else's, echoing behind a senator's back, slipping between amphorae in the marketplace. The rumour? That he was seen leaving a certain domus far too late, his belt undone, his hair dishevelled, and worse, his sandals mismatched. In Rome, such a sight wasn't just embarrassing, it was evidence. And once a rumour started, it didn't walk, it galloped. Rome had no tabloid press, no paparazzi, no comment sections. What it had instead were scribes, satirists, and statues, tools that could destroy someone's name more efficiently than any sword. A well-placed anecdote could collapse a man's career. A single bit of graffiti, if clever enough, could trail him for life. You pass now by a wall in Pompeii, still etched with fire. Lucius enjoys the company of his slave boy more than his wife. Crude? Yes. Invented? Possibly. Effective? Absolutely. Even if false, such a message could infect the public imagination, because in Rome, shame didn't need proof, it just needed volume. Scandal had teeth, and it bit often. Take Clodius Pulcher, a Roman politician with a flair for chaos. He once snuck into the women-only Bonadea festival, dressed in drag, to seduce Julius Caesar's wife. He was caught, charged with sacrilege. His defense? I didn't do it. His friend's defense? Even if he did, it wasn't sacrilegious. It was romantic. The scandal shook the Republic. Caesar divorced his wife anyway, stating that Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. Let that sink in, not innocent, just beyond suspicion. In Rome, perception was everything. Even emperors weren't safe. Tiberius, Augustus's successor, retired to Capri, where whispers followed him like perfume. Historians accused him of hosting wild orgies, keeping children as minnows trained to swim between his legs, and other less repeatable offences. Are these stories true? Maybe, maybe not, but they stuck. Tiberius died with power. Yes, but not with dignity. One of the strangest scandals, the case of Valeria Messalina, wife of Claudius. You've met her before, infamous for supposedly sneaking out to work at a brothel under an alias. But the rumour that really stuck? That she held a competition with a prostitute to see who could bed the most clients in one night. According to Pliny, Messalina won, exhausted but triumphant. It likely never happened, but the myth was too delicious to ignore. Romans weren't just gossip-hungry, they were narrative-hungry. They believed every powerful woman must have a secret appetite, every quiet man a double life. You pause near a statue with no head. The plinth reads, "Tu decimus, most virtuous." A curious choice of words. He was famously accused of seducing the wives of 3 magistrates. His defense, he claimed they seduced him. Rome responded by removing his statue's head. Not the whole statue, just the symbol of reason and honor. It was a very Roman punishment, aesthetic and cutting. Sometimes scandals were forged through performance. The orator Cicero, beloved for his wit and devastating rhetoric, once eviscerated his rival Clodius in court by reciting an alleged love letter he wrote to a male actor. Cicero added dramatic flair, changing voices, mimicking moans. The courtroom laughed. Clodius never recovered. Still, not all shaming was verbal. The tunic without belt, or tunicula sine singulo, was a classic sign of disgrace. Slaves were paraded in it. Adulterers, too. It hung loose, formless, weak. To be seen in one was to be marked as vulnerable, exposed. The Roman version of a scarlet letter. And what about women? Their reputations were more fragile than amphora handles in a wine riot. A single accusation of adultery could destroy a life, even an unfounded one. One fringe case, a woman named Sulpicia, accused of sleeping with her son-in-law. The courts dismissed the claim, but the poet Martial still wrote a verse about it, mocking her scent, her thighs, her laugh. She'd been cleared by law, but not by society. Even funerals could be scandalous. One poor senator, Flavius Piso, had a former lover show up weeping louder than the widow. The gossip made it all the way to the Senate. His final legacy. Loved too boldly, buried too awkwardly. Historians still argue whether these tales were true or rhetorical weapons, but in Rome the line between reality and satire was slippery. A good story beat a good defense. You turn now onto a quieter street. The walls here are less graffiti-stained, the air softer. Perhaps this is where someone came to walk after the rumors started, to breathe, to forget, to hope that the whispers would pass, because shame in Rome was sticky but not always eternal. Time wore down statues, graffiti faded, a well-timed marriage, an inherited title, a generous festival. These could all repair a reputation. Let the torches burn low now, let the whispers fall silent. Let the statues, faceless though they are, return to their stillness. And let your breath become even, steady, untouched by rumor or ridicule. Because here, tonight, no one is watching, no one is judging, only sleep remains. The stone beneath your feet feels warmer now, worn smooth by 1,000 barefoot steps. You pass into a smaller room, not ornate, not grand, but purposeful. Shelves hold tiny statues. Dried herbs hang near the doorway. A shallow bowl of ash sits quietly on a corner table. This is not a bedroom or a courtroom or a brothel. This is a space of rituals, because in ancient Rome, even sex came with ceremony. The Romans didn't believe in separating the sacred from the sensual. In fact, they often overlapped, blurring the lines between divine ritual and personal experience. Every act, every touch had its time, its place, and its appropriate offering. Nothing was left to chance, not even pleasure. Before intimacy, many Romans followed private traditions. Some whispered to Venus, some burned a pinch of myrrh, others sprinkled rose petals on the bed, not just for scent, but to invite the goddess in. If you were especially superstitious, you might recite a charm or tie a red thread around your wrist, not for romance, for protection. Because desire, in Roman eyes, was volatile. It stirred the blood, but it also attracted spirits. To guard against the evil eye, or worse, performance anxiety, some lovers rubbed their feet with ash or hung garlic cloves near the bed. No, really. Garlic. The ancient Roman answer to awkward silences. But post-coitus, that's where the rituals got even stranger. Some Romans washed immediately, using rosewater or diluted vinegar. Not just to cleanse the body, but to symbolically wash away desire. They believed pleasure, unchecked, could lead to madness or weakness. Balance the humours, the physicians advised. Too much heat leads to ruin. Nothing like a cold splash of vinegar to kill the mood. For others, the end of intimacy was marked with an offering. A few drops of wine spilled on the floor. A sliver of bread left out overnight. One lover might even pluck a single hair from the other's head, then toss it into the fire while making a silent wish. The idea? Seal the moment. Prevent it from lingering too long. You spot a carved ivory comb on the table, its teeth dulled by time. These were often gifted after a night together, tokens of affection sometimes engraved with tiny verses like, "You smoothed my hair, I smoothed your heart." A bit corny, sure. But in a city where affection was rare and reputation fragile, small gestures carried real weight. One fringe tradition? In some households, a servant was summoned after sex, not to clean, but to clear the air. They'd walk through the room with incense or even clanging cymbals, not unlike a spiritual palate cleanser. Because the gods apparently appreciated a little post-act courtesy, and in more formal settings, say a union meant to produce heirs, the rituals got serious, the bed was blessed, the couple wore white. Offerings were made to Juno, goddess of marriage, and Priapus, god of, well, enthusiasm. A priest might even oversee the proceedings, though hopefully not too closely. In rural areas, some Romans observed seasonal fertility rites tied to agriculture. During certain festivals, couples would spend a night together in fields or orchards, hoping to mirror nature's abundance. One particularly earthy celebration involved couples placing grain beneath the bed and burning it the next morning as an offering to Ceres. Love, lust, and harvest, all bundled together like a spring bouquet. Of course, these rituals weren't always shared. Many were private inventions, passed from lover to lover, generation to generation. A certain touch, a whispered phrase, a charm stitched into a pillow. But not all post-intimacy rituals were tender. For those in transactional encounters, the after was swift. No incense, no rosewater, just coins left on a stool and the turning of a back. One graffiti from Pompeii reads, 3 denarii, no kiss. Brisk, brutal, bared of ceremony. And for those whose unions were forbidden, cross-class, same-sex, adulterous, the rituals were often more anxious. One man wrote to his lover, "I leave bread on your doorstep each morning, even if I cannot knock." That was the ritual. A gesture half-glimpsed, wholly tender. Even celibacy had rituals. Vestal virgins, Rome's most sacred priestesses, took vows of chastity and were watched relentlessly. But their rituals were no less intimate. They bathed in sacred water, anointed their bodies with oils blessed by Vesta, and slept alone in silence, under stars they swore never to explain. You now sit beside a small oil lamp, its wick flickering low. This lamp, too, was part of the rite. In some households, lovers lit one before and after intimacy. Not just to see, but to signal. When the lamp was snuffed, the moment ended. The desire folded neatly back into routine. It's strange, isn't it? In a world so obsessed with dominance and performance, ritual gave permission to pause, to breathe, to reflect, even to connect, however briefly, with something larger than yourself. Let the lamp flicker now. Let the scent of lavender and smoke drift upward. Let your breath match the rhythm of the flame, because tonight, even after the act, there is softness, there is stillness, there is time to rest. You awaken gently into a different kind of noise, laughter, shouting, the distant clink of pottery. The air smells of roasted nuts and spilled wine, and the streets are dotted with ivy crowns, overturned stools, and people who clearly haven't slept. You're in the middle of Saturnalia, Rome's wildest holiday. For 1 week a year, the rules changed. For 1 week, masters served slaves, laws bent backward, and pleasure was practically mandatory. This wasn't a modest feast. Saturnalia was a full social reversal, a carnival of chaos where the usual hierarchies were flipped, at least symbolically. You'd think a rigid society like Rome couldn't handle that, and you'd be right, which is exactly why they needed it. The festival began on December 17th and gradually stretched to nearly a full week by the late Republic. It honored Saturn, the god of sowing and time, a figure associated with a mythical golden age when everyone was equal, food was plentiful, and no one owned anyone else. A tempting fantasy. One that Rome tried, briefly and boisterously, to recreate. First, the roles reversed. Masters waited on slaves. Slaves were allowed to speak freely, sometimes even mock their owners to their faces. For this 1 week, the Roman social pyramid wobbled, not because they believed in equality, but because they believed in releasing pressure. Let everyone laugh at the system, just long enough to stop them from tearing it down. You wander into a villa where garlands hang haphazardly across columns. A slave sits at the head of the table, wearing a bright tunic and a gold paper crown. His master, grinning, pours him wine. They toast, everyone laughs. It's cheerful, yes, but the tension hums just below the surface. Everyone knows it's temporary. Even gambling, usually banned, was allowed during Saturnalia. Children tossed knucklebones, old senators bet on dice. Coins clattered onto tiles with the same glee you'd hear in today's casinos. The losers shrugged, the winners crowed. But no one hoarded, because to be stingy during Saturnalia was a social sin. Generosity was the rule, even if you had to fake it. And gifts? Oh yes, small symbolic offerings passed between friends and strangers alike. Wax candles, nuts, tiny figurines, pouches of spices. Nothing extravagant. Saturnalia wasn't about flexing wealth. It was about participation, about saying, we are in this upside-down world together. One fringe gift, a writing tablet with the inscription, "May this bring you more pleasure than my company ever did." Snarky, sweet, very Roman, and what about sex? Oh, it didn't stop, it spilled into the streets. The moral watchman looked away. The brothels stayed open later. Neighbours paired off without so much as a proper greeting. If Venus ruled Rome most of the year, she reigned unchallenged during Saturnalia. Poets didn't hold back. Catullus called it the best of days. Martial used the festival as an excuse to poke fun at everyone, senators, shopkeepers, even himself. He wrote of gifts too cheap, slaves too clever, and lovers too drunk to remember whose house they'd wandered into. You pass a public square where actors perform lewd parodies of political speeches. One wears a senator's robe, inside out, and recites a law in a ridiculous falsetto. The crowd howls. The guards do nothing. It's Saturnalia. The senator himself might be watching from the balcony, grinning through gritted teeth. But underneath the laughter lies something serious. For slaves, Saturnalia was one of the only times they could speak their mind. One Roman household reportedly encouraged enslaved people to offer feedback during the feast. Some joked, some ranted, some simply sat in the master's chair and enjoyed the warmth. Was it real freedom? No. But it was something, a breath, a reminder that the system, however firm, was still man-made. Even children sensed the change. They dressed up, stayed up late, mimicked their elders, and laughed at jokes they didn't understand. For them, Saturnalia was magic, a moment when their voices filled the room without being shushed. And for women? It depended. The rules relaxed, yes, but not equally. Wives still had to navigate appearances. Courtesans, though, enjoyed greater visibility. Some walked boldly through forums, exchanging banter with senators. For once, they weren't whispered about. They were toasted. One curious tidbit? During Saturnalia, some households appointed a mock king, the Saturnalitius Princeps, or Lord of Misrule. This figure gave absurd orders. Sing before you drink. Swap clothes with the cook. Speak only in animal noises. Everyone obeyed, laughing, because even pretend power felt delicious. And sometimes the Lord of Misrule was a slave, but the reversal always ended. As the final day of Saturnalia faded, togas were rewrapped with care, crowns set aside, and roles resumed. The laughter quieted. The masters sat again at the head of the table. The world reassembled itself, piece by piece. You stand now beneath a laurel tree, its leaves trembling in the wind. Around you, remnants of the festival, candle stubs, overturned cups, footprints in ash. A soft melancholy settles, not sadness, just the awareness of limits. Saturnalia was permission, not change, a holiday, not a revolution. Let the garlands fall now. Let the dice rest in their bowls. Let your breath deepen as the city eases back into silence, the memory of reversal still warm against the cold. because even in a world obsessed with order, the Romans knew sometimes you must flip the rules just long enough to keep them intact. The festival haze lingers faintly as you move away from the villas and toward the fringes of the city, the places where things were less polished, more human. Here the walls are faded, the bricks chipped, and the voices softer. This is the realm of the common Romans, the freedmen, artisans, labourers, and washerwomen. And when it came to love, passion, and power, their world had its own rules, because not everyone lived in marble palaces or threw parties for poets. Most Romans lived in insulae, cramped apartment buildings several stories high. The walls were thin, the floors creaky, and privacy was a polite illusion. Still, desire made room for itself, even here. Love found corners. Lust borrowed shadows. You climb a narrow stairwell and find yourself in a modest one-room flat. A low bed, a clay jug of water, 2 stools, and an oil lamp. Not much, but enough. On the wall, scrawled in fading red paint, a message. I love Tertia, even when she's angry. It's not poetry, but it's honest. Among the lower classes, sex wasn't coated in incense and myth. It was practical, sometimes hurried, often complicated. A baker's apprentice might fall for a laundress, stealing kisses behind steaming vats. A stonemason might barter a carved figurine for a few sweet minutes with a neighbour. And every gesture, every smile, every knock at the door came with risk. Marriage, for the working class, was more flexible but less protected. Many couples cohabited without formal contracts, concubinage, as it was called, perfectly legal, not quite respectable. These unions often lasted years, even decades. Some bore children, some didn't, but they lived as husband and wife in every way but name. Still, concubines had no inheritance rights, no titles. If the man died, his legal wife, or even his grown children, could evict the concubine in a heartbeat. And yet many men chose these informal partnerships. Why? Because they were often based on affection, not alliance. One rare inscription from a freedman reads, "To my Julia, who warmed my winters, who sang even in the dark. I was poor, but I was loved." That's the kind of power that doesn't show up in Senate records. And what about same-sex relationships among the working poor? They existed, though fewer letters survive. Most of what we know comes from graffiti, drawings, dirty jokes, or sometimes surprising tenderness. One reads simply, "He smiled at me." No name, no slurs, just that. A stolen moment carved into brick. Fringe sources suggest some brothels catered to couples, yes, couples, who couldn't find privacy at home. For a small fee, lovers could rent a clean bed, a locked door, and maybe even a fig-scented pillow. Think of it as the ancient Roman version of a cheap motel with slightly more frescoes. You pass now by a public fountain where 2 women fill jars and chat in Latin laced with slang. One asks if the other's new lover sings like a god. The second laughs and says, "No, more like a donkey, but sweeter." And then they giggle, not because the world is easy, but because the moment is. Among the poor, rituals were simpler. A shared loaf of bread could mean intimacy. A polished pebble gifted on a walk could mean loyalty. One woman stitched her name into the hem of her lover's tunic, not so others would see, but so he would remember. Quiet magic, thread by thread. And children? Many grew up hearing everything through thin walls. A boy might hear his parents' whispered laughter at night and learn that love wasn't always loud. A girl might watch her mother light a tiny oil lamp and know, without words, that it meant someone was coming over. Historians still debate whether these quieter unions were more egalitarian than those among the elite. Was there more freedom, less judgment, or simply less visibility? We may never know. The records are patchy. The love was not. Among freed slaves particularly, romance was complicated. Some found each other after years of servitude, rebuilding lives together in small shops or taverns. One man inscribed a message on his storefront, "She was bought, but she chose me." A tiny rebellion in 6 words. But for many, survival took precedence. A fishmonger might marry a widow for her stall space. A street performer might pair up with a spice vendor for mutual security. Were these marriages of convenience? Possibly. But comfort, in a city as chaotic as Rome, was its own kind of intimacy. You now walk down a side alley past laundry strung between buildings like prayer flags. A cat darts past your ankles. Somewhere above, a baby cries. Somewhere below, someone sings. And in one open window, two figures lean toward each other, foreheads nearly touching. No fanfare, no gods, just breath and warmth, and two silhouettes glowing in lamplight. Let that image stay with you, because even among Rome's humblest citizens the language of love was rich, not in marble or coin, but in rituals of survival, affection, and stolen sweetness. Love was scratched into wood, carried in satchels, folded into laundry. Let the footsteps fade now, let the markets quiet, let the lovers drift back to their dreams. And you too, breathe softer, sink deeper. Because in the most unpolished corners of Rome, you've found something unexpectedly pure. The morning haze lingers on the stone columns as you drift into Rome's open-air heart, the Forum, but this time not to listen or argue or vote. You're here to watch. Not the speakers, but the bodies, because in ancient Rome, what you wore and didn't wear was more than fashion. It was a message, a display, a flex, and no matter your rank, your body was on display whether you liked it or not. The Romans were a visual people. They read bodies like scrolls, deciphering status, virtue, and reputation based on how someone walked, stood, or adjusted a belt. A man's exposed forearm could speak volumes. A woman's veil or lack thereof might launch a whisper campaign before lunch. You start with the toga, heavy, itchy, ridiculous in the summer, and yet required for Roman male citizens. It wasn't just a garment, it was a costume of legitimacy. No toga? People assumed you were either a slave, a foreigner, or dangerously lazy. Senators wore togas with a wide purple stripe, boys with a narrow one, and generals occasionally dipped theirs in red to show off. They were walking resumes, but underneath that wool cocoon, the real show began. Roman grooming standards were intense. Men waxed or shaved regularly. Chest hair was out, arm hair discouraged, back hair, let's just say Roman poets weren't kind about it. The ideal male form was youthful, smooth, and athletic, even if your job involved sitting in the Senate and dramatically sighing all day. And then there were the nudity zones, public baths, gymnasiums, statues, gladiator arenas, all places where nudity wasn't just accepted, it was analyzed. At the baths, people stripped down completely, not for intimacy but for hygiene and judgment. Every scar, every tan line, every blemish told a story. If your muscles were too soft, people whispered. If your tan was uneven, they assumed you were lazy. If you covered yourself modestly, they mocked your prudery. If you strutted too much, they rolled their eyes. The baths were Rome's Instagram, basically. Women, on the other hand, were taught to hide and reveal strategically. The stola was the married woman's uniform, a long draped gown that said, "I'm respectable, don't flirt with me, unless you're rich and discreet." Unmarried women wore tunics, widows played with darker colours, courtesans, often dressed above their class, using pearls, perfumes and dyed silks to attract attention and controversy. But it wasn't just about fabric. A woman's hairstyle could mark her status, her mood, even her politics. Elaborate curls and braids weren't vanity, they were declarations. One fringe source claimed a senator's wife once switched her hairstyle mid-Senate scandal as a form of protest. Fashion as rebellion, how very Roman. And let's not forget accessories. Rings were signals, so were belts, brooches, even sandals. Some women walked in shoes carved with messages on the sole, so their footsteps would leave behind poetry or insults in the dust. Imagine stepping out for errands and leaving behind, "I despise Gaius," in muddy cursive. Historians still argue whether these codes were enforced by law or by culture. Likely both. Either way, they carried weight. You pass by a statue now, a man heroically nude with carefully chiseled abs and an improbable stance. His real-life counterpart probably had a gut and back pain, but in marble he is eternal. Romans didn't sculpt bodies as they were. they sculpted ideals. A reminder of what you should be, or wish you could pretend to be. Even slaves were judged by their bodies. Strong backs were prized. Pretty faces, especially in domestic service, could change your fate entirely. A beautiful boy or girl might be spared harsher tasks, only to endure more intimate ones. You've seen how that went. One odd detail. There were auctions where slaves were sold naked, not out of cruelty, though it certainly was, but so buyers could assess their quality, muscle tone, teeth, even proportions. Yes, the body was currency, sometimes literally. And yet not all displays were voluntary. Punishment often involved forced exposure. Adulterers might be paraded through the streets without a cloak, criminals branded on the forehead, prostitutes required to dye their hair, blonde, a mark of shame, turned into a twisted badge of office. But the most famous display of all, the gladiator. You enter the arena now, not in battle, but in stillness. Sand covers the ground like snow. You can almost hear the cheers, the pounding feet, the hot breath of anticipation. Gladiators were sex symbols and political tools. Their bodies were sculpted not in marble, but in scar tissue and sweat. Posters, yes, actual posters, advertised their fights like concerts. Crixus the Gaul, undefeated, returns this Saturday. Women threw wreaths, men placed bets. Some even carved graffiti admiring specific gladiator muscles. One Pompeii inscription reads, "Celadus the Thracian makes all the girls sigh." But gladiators had no real freedom. Their beauty was for others to consume, their fame temporary, their bodies disposable, and yet admired, desired, paraded like demigods in loincloths. As you step away from the arena, the forum quiets again. The robes return, the veils flutter, the fashion rules reassert themselves, but you've seen beneath them now. Let your own breath slow. Let the imagined fabric fall away, because under all the robes, under all the rules, every Roman was just a body in the open, trying to perform, to survive, to be seen. And tonight, in your soft darkness, no one sees but you. Let the eyes close. Let the stage dim. Let the performances end. You find yourself now in a quieter space, away from the roar of the forum and the spectacle of the arena. A humble kitchen garden winds along a villa's back wall. Fig trees, lavender, a few dusty herbs clinging to cracked terracotta pots. A bronze mirror leans on a windowsill, polished to a soft, wavy sheen. Because now we're shifting from the public to the private. From bodies meant to be admired to bodies in the quiet routines of daily care. You're entering the world of the erotic and the everyday, where olive oil wasn't just for cooking, mirrors weren't just for vanity, and intimacy was often less about heat and more about habit. Start with the oil. Romans didn't have soap, at least not the frothy stuff you're picturing. They relied on olive oil, rubbed into the skin, then scraped off with a strigil, a curved metal blade. It wasn't just for hygiene. It was exfoliation, deodorant, moisturizer, and occasionally aphrodisiac, all in one. At the baths, you'd see entire crowds oiling up, chatting, glistening in the sunlight. But at home, the ritual was more intimate. A wife might oil her husband's back. A courtesan might scent the oil with rose or cinnamon. One inscription even recommends mixing oil with crushed mint to keep the scent of desire all day. That's right. Ancient Roman body butter. Unofficial slogan, smell like a god, sweat like a legionnaire. And mirrors, oh the mirrors, not glass, but polished metal, silver, bronze or tin. They warped images, but that didn't stop anyone. Romans stared into them with theatrical intensity, practicing smiles, checking posture, studying each other's eyes. Mirrors weren't just tools, they were props. In some households, mirrors were kept beside beds. Why? To watch. Themselves, each other, the whole awkward choreography of pleasure. One fringe source even claims that a wealthy merchant installed a mirrored ceiling in his domus 2,000 years before Vegas. Subtle? Not even a little. But beyond performance, the mirror also served as charm and warning. Some women refused to look into them before certain rituals, fearing it would bring bad luck or spoil a lover's memory. Others kissed their reflection before leaving home, a quick, silent vow of confidence. And what about grooming? Tweezers, pumice stones, small blades. Romans loved a good pluck and polish. Men removed body hair meticulously, women trimmed, painted, and styled. The idea was not to chase beauty, but manage desirability. A slightly different beast. Even breath freshening was part of the game. Chewing parsley, rinsing with vinegar. One satirist mocked a man who ate honey for breakfast but still spoke like a fishmonger. Apparently mint wasn't cutting it. Now you're in a woman's dressing room, low light, wood-coffered ceiling, faint smell of incense and aged perfume. She's carefully pinning her hair, twisting it into the fashionable triple knot. A slave stands beside her, holding a small box of cosmetics, white lead for skin, kohl for eyes, rouge made from mulberries or crushed insects. Was it safe? Not really, but it worked. The desired look was pale, smooth, slightly tragic, like you'd just read sad poetry and then fainted onto silk. Very appealing. These rituals weren't trivial. They were acts of control in a world where women had few powers. To apply eyeliner was to sculpt identity. To arrange a braid just so was to signal intention, flirtation, rejection, curiosity, defiance. Some men mocked these routines. The poet Juvenal railed against women who spent too much time painting themselves into someone else, but others were obsessed. Love letters survive filled with lines like, "I dream of your scent more than your words. Your wrist, when you tie your sandals, haunts me." Even the smallest act, a stretch, a tilt of the head, could seduce. And it wasn't just lovers who noticed. The household watched too. Servants saw everything. Children peeked from doorways. Gossip travelled faster than the aqueducts. If you wore too much perfume, someone whispered. If you wore none, someone assumed heartbreak. You couldn't win, but you could perform. And yet many Romans found deep comfort in these habits. One widow, in a surviving letter, writes, "I still oil the space where your shoulders used to rest." A daily act, a daily ache. Historians still argue how much of this self-care was about seduction versus survival. Was it romantic, sensual, merely social expectation? Probably all three. Human beings, after all, haven't changed as much as we like to think. There's something beautiful in the way the mundane becomes sacred, a mirror that remembers your face, an oil jar that warms your palms, a braid that holds the shape of a memory. These aren't grand rituals, they're tiny devotions. And so as you step back into the twilight, you carry the weight of their meaning. Let your own routines soften now, and let the room dim. Let the oil settle in its jar, the mirror fog at the edges, the scent of lavender linger on the skin. Because in ancient Rome, as in your world, even the smallest acts could whisper, "You are seen, you are wanted, you are here." You follow the path of parchment and ink now, gliding through a quiet villa where candlelight flickers beside tightly rolled scrolls. This isn't the Senate's paperwork or some dusty historian's archive. These are love letters, tender, awkward, bold, and sometimes hilariously bad. Because long before texting "you up" at 2 a.m., Romans were pouring their longing, confusion, and horn-blown declarations of devotion into ink. And you're about to read some of them. Let's start with a typical scenario. A young Roman soldier posted far from home, missing the perfume of his lover's hair more than his rations. He's got nothing but scratchy parchment, a crude stylus, and too much time. The result? Your absence wounds me more than the German cold. Poetic? Sort of. Desperate? Very effective. Who knows? Letters weren't private. They passed through hands, were read aloud, sometimes copied and saved by scribes. So even in supposed intimacy, people performed. The phrasing was elevated, even when the feelings were earthy. A Roman man might write, "I burn for you like Vesuvius before it knew Pompeii," which, if you're keeping score, is both romantic and ominously volcanic. Women wrote too, though fewer of their letters survived. Still, the ones we have are telling. One unnamed woman wrote, "You speak of conquest, but I remember you as soft and sweet and slightly foolish. Come home." There it is, a mix of affection and that gentle Roman insult we now call Flirting through honesty. Love letters weren't always well written. In fact, many were messy. Think ink blotches, poor Latin grammar, confused metaphors. One disgruntled suitor tried comparing his beloved to a silver urn full of wine and bees. Interpret that how you will. And then there were love curses. Yes, not letters to someone, but curses against rivals. These were scratched into lead tablets and buried at crossroads or thrown into sacred wells. One, discovered near a Roman bathhouse, reads, "May Licinia's hair fall out and her breath turn sour until Gaius forgets her." A bit harsh, but effective, who can say? Hair products weren't great back then. Some letters were transactional. A courtesan might write to a client using language that danced between warmth and invoice. "Your coin arrived. So did the figs. You're still 2 favors behind, but I remember your laugh." The boundary between desire and economics was always a little fuzzy. Even married couples wrote notes, little tokens slipped into togas. "Don't be late. I missed last night. Try not to argue with my uncle again." These mundane scraps, when found centuries later, crackle with life. One fragment written in charcoal on a wall. "Wait for me behind the fish stall." It could be a tryst or a grocery run. Either way, it's intimate. Mirrors, oils, perfume, they spoke one language. Letters spoke another. One that could span cities, wars, lifetimes. A letter might outlive the sender, the recipient, and the house it was written in. Some travelled hundreds of miles tied with twine, kissed for luck. You read one now traced into soft wax. "I saw a bird today with feathers like your cloak. It sang badly. I missed you more." A disaster of syntax, a triumph of heart. Historians still debate how honest Roman love letters were. Were they formulaic, like greeting cards? Were they plagiarized from poets? Did the sender even mean it? But maybe that's the point. Longing doesn't have to be eloquent, just real. You now step into a dim study lit only by one candle. On the desk, a blank wax tablet. A stylus rests beside it. No words yet, just potential. Would you write something? Would you dare? Maybe just, "I saw a star and thought of you." Maybe that's enough. Let the candle flicker lower. Let the ink cool. Let the imagined letters fold into soft parchment dreams. Because whether shouted in marble halls or whispered behind stalls, every Roman lover tried to leave a trace. And tonight, those traces are yours to keep. The letters fade behind you as you step back into the streets of Rome, where dusk paints the stones in soft gold, and shadows stretch long like the whispers of memory. But you don't head home just yet. No, you turn instead toward the taverns, those smoky, raucous, terribly beloved corners of the Roman world where wine loosened tongues and lust curled in the corners of laughter. Because if there was one place where Roman flirtation came alive and often fell flat, it was here. Taverns or popinae weren't just watering holes. They were social theatres, a little grimy, a little dangerous, and entirely essential. Everyone from freedmen to petty officials might crowd shoulder to shoulder under low ceilings, sipping cheap Mulsum, honeyed wine, and trying to look less desperate than they felt. You enter one now, ducking under a beam, as the murmur of voices wraps around you like steam. The room smells of garlic, smoke, olives, and spilled wine. A flute plays lazily in a corner, dice rattle. And in the middle of it all, flirtation, Roman style. Forget subtlety, a man might call across the room, "Your eyes burn brighter than Vesta's flame." Romantic? Maybe. Effective? Not when he follows it with, "Buy me a drink if you agree." Pick-up lines were an art or a tragedy. One recorded example: "You look like you taste of figs and thunder." What does that even mean? Historians don't know, but someone definitely tried it. Women in taverns were often assumed to be either courtesans or scandalously bold, and maybe some were, but many were just tired of being quiet elsewhere. They came to laugh, to eat, to dance badly to a flute solo. Some even gambled, elbowing men aside to shout over the dice. A fringe tradition. In certain taverns, if two strangers exchanged the same cup 3 times, It was considered an informal invitation to share more than wine. One satirist mocked this by writing, "She passed the cup 3 times, and took my heart, my purse, and my sandals." Drunken declarations abounded. "I'll build you a villa. I'll name my goat after you. I'll divorce my wife." Whether or not they remembered any of it the next morning is anyone's guess. You glance toward a chalkboard near the bar. Today's specials: wine, bread, stew, bad decisions. At the back of the tavern, a couple leans close, whispering in Latin, and giggles. She fingers the edge of his tunic. He traces a pattern on the table. No gods invoked, no marriage contracts. Just 2 humans, a little tipsy, playing a timeless game. Flirtation here wasn't always about outcome. Sometimes it was about practice, about feeling seen, about having a clever reply or being bold for just one evening. And when things moved forward, there were rooms upstairs, tiny, bare, a mattress, a curtain, maybe a borrowed comb, transactions blurred with tenderness. One woman painted a heart on her wall after a guest left, writing, "He was kind, that was enough." But taverns weren't safe for everyone. Fights broke out. Jealous lovers followed each other in. Some flirtations ended in slammed fists or spilled wine. One law even banned senators from owning taverns because they were deemed too morally chaotic. Still, the Peppina thrived. Even the elite slipped in under cloaks and false names. Historians still argue whether one famous general seduced his 3rd mistress over stewed lentils and flute solos. If true, it's probably Rome's most tragic love story, and perhaps its most relatable. You step outside now, the din behind you softening with distance. The night air cools your face, and just ahead, 2 lovers walk with arms brushing. Close, but not quite holding. They pause under a torch. He leans in, she laughs. No vows, no letters, just a moment. Because sometimes in Rome, love didn't come with incense or carved inscriptions. Sometimes it came with garlic breath, and wine-stained teeth, and a muttered, "Come upstairs." Let that scene settle in your mind like wine in a clay cup. Let it swirl. Let it sweeten. Because even in the smoky corners, in the loud rooms, in the places history tries to forget, there was longing and hope and the soft flutter of maybe. And now, back in the quiet of your own space, you too can loosen your grip on the day. Let the dice fall. Let the flute fade. Let your heart remember that awkward, sweet human desire to be noticed, even if it sounds like figs and thunder. By now you've wandered through bedrooms and bathhouses, letters and taverns, but you've yet to visit the most myth-soaked part of Roman intimacy, the divine side of desire. Tonight you step into temples not to pray for rain or war's end, but for love, lust, and something in between. Because in ancient Rome, gods weren't distant. They meddled, they whispered. They eavesdropped on lovers and occasionally joined in. You start with Venus, goddess of love, beauty, seduction. The Roman answer to the Greek Aphrodite, but with a Roman twist, less about doves, more about dominion. Venus wasn't just about flutters of the heart, she was about control, attraction as power, beauty as weapon. Her temples were some of the most visited in Rome, especially the temple of Venus Erycina on the Capitoline Hill. And guess what? People didn't just go there to admire marble. They came to ask for lovers, for better partners, for, let's say, improved stamina. Offerings ranged from flowers and incense to tiny figurines, some shockingly detailed in anatomy. A woman hoping for fertility might leave a carved womb, a man a wax replica of his own ambition. One particularly cheeky graffiti near a Venus temple reads, "I offered Venus a fig, and she gave me twins. Be careful." Then there was Priapus, gardener, protector of boundaries, and owner of the most alarmingly exaggerated statue collection in history. You're warned before you even approach one. Priapus is not subtle. His statues were planted, pun intended, in orchards, front yards, and street corners, part scarecrow, part fertility charm, part ancient Roman lawn ornament. Some homes even placed tiny Priapus figures by the front door. Why? To ward off thieves and maybe encourage romantic visitors. He was crass, yes, but also a kind of everyman's god, beloved by farmers and poets alike. The poet Horace once joked that Priapus scolded him for being too prudish for Rome. Imagine being roasted by a deity while walking past a fruit stand. And what about Cupid? Not the diapered cherub you're thinking of. Roman Cupido was sharp, winged, and armed. His arrows didn't just inspire affection, they stirred obsession, lust, irrational choices. One myth even blames Cupid for causing a senator to abandon his speech mid-sentence and propose marriage to a flute player instead. The Senate was not amused. Then there's Liber, an older god of wine, freedom, and unrestrained behavior. His festivals were raucous. Think masks, dancing, maybe a goat or two. Some say Liber's rites were the precursors to carnival. Others say they were an excuse for Romans to misbehave with divine permission. Historians still argue whether these fertility festivals actually included ritual intimacy, or whether that's a later invention by scandal-loving scribes. Either way, the gods were always present. You step now into a smaller shrine, a domestic altar tucked into the corner of a villa courtyard. A simple flame flickers. A painted Venus stands beside a bowl of olive oil and 2 figs. Someone has placed a hairpin at her feet, an offering, or maybe a thank you. Because worship wasn't just public. It was private, woven into the rhythms of daily life. Lighting a candle before a date, whispering a plea to the gods before slipping on new sandals, washing one's face in rosewater and saying, "Make me noticeable today." You've probably done something like it, even if you didn't call it prayer. And then, of course, the temples of Isis, imported from Egypt, wildly popular in Rome, especially among women. Isis promised protection, fertility, and rebirth. Her rites were veiled in mystery, involving water, music, and candlelit ceremonies that left people both awed and a little unnerved. One surviving account describes a man, heartbroken, who joins the Isis cult after a lover's betrayal, only to claim that the goddess touched him in a dream and healed his sorrow. Real or imagined, who's to say? Rome welcomed foreign gods like fashion trends, Mithras, Cybele, even obscure love spirits tucked into roadside shrines. If it promised emotional healing, someone probably prayed to it, and if it involved wine or dancing or even just the possibility of romance, even better, you pass now a wall fresco faded with time. It shows Venus standing on a seashell, one hand raised, eyes closed, but beside her, a mortal couple, tangled in a quiet embrace, half-dressed, half-lit by the imagined sun. That was the point of it all, wasn't it? To feel that your love, or lust, or hope mattered to the heavens. Let that thought sink in. Let the gods grow silent again. Let the temple shadows return to cool stone. Because tonight you don't need a statue to feel seen. You don't need an offering to be worthy. You just need the quiet echo of ancient desire and the knowledge that even Rome's immortals believed in longing. Let the candle burn low now. Let the fig rest uneaten. Let the whispers of Venus and Priapus and Cupid blur into sleep. Now the temples recede and the gods grow quiet, though they never stray far. You wander through a shaded peristyle garden, soft gravel underfoot, moonlight brushing the tops of trimmed hedges. Here, in the hush after laughter and offerings, you encounter something quieter, more elusive, and no less powerful than lust. You meet Roman loneliness. Yes, loneliness, the uninvited guest at every banquet, the silent figure in crowded streets, the pause between love letters. For all their passion and posturing, the Romans were no strangers to isolation. And in the world of desire, few things cut sharper than feeling unseen. Take the widows, for instance. Roman society had rules for everything, even grief. A woman who lost her husband might be expected to mourn for 10 months, sometimes a full year. No wine, no jewelry, no new suitors, just shadow-coloured clothes and long, aching days. But mourning didn't erase longing. You read one fragment, written in a shaky hand. They say I must not laugh, but my heart still calls for warmth. She might have lit a candle to Venus anyway, quietly, when no one was looking. And what of the men who returned from war, the ones who had sent all those passionate letters, promising figs and eternal devotion? Sometimes they came home to changed cities, lovers moved on, wives remarried, children grown. The reunion was less a triumphant embrace, more an awkward dinner in a house that no longer remembered their voice. Historians still argue how emotionally literate Roman men were. Were their poems sincere or formulaic? But scratch the surface of those stiff inscriptions and you find longing bleeding through. Take this one, etched into a villa wall. I sat beside her once. She forgot my name. I remember her smell. Even among the famously verbose, some things went unsaid. You walk past a market stall now, shutters drawn. But someone has scratched a message into the wood. He looked at me and didn't stop. I am ruined. Maybe they were lovers. Maybe they weren't. Maybe it was just a glance that lingered too long. In Rome, that was sometimes all it took. There were those who loved people they couldn't have, slaves who adored their masters, courtesans who fell for clients, senators who pined for poets, and those whose affections crossed not just class, but gender, quietly, cautiously, dangerously. The poet Martial once wrote verses to both men and women. Ovid, too, toyed with fluidity in his amores. But public acceptance was fickle. Relationships that defied norms were rarely condemned outright, but they were always watched. A man might share his home with another man for years, affectionately, platonically, erotically. Who could say? The law didn't always intervene. Society, however, whispered constantly. And what about those who chose no one? Romans who never married, never wrote poems, never flirted over olives and wine. Were they lonely or simply uninterested? A few inscriptions suggest serenity in solitude. I belonged to myself, and that was enough. Still the pressure remained, to couple, to produce heirs, to be seen arm in arm at festivals. Desire in Rome wasn't just personal, it was public expectation. You pass now into a smaller domus once owned by a wealthy merchant. In the atrium a mosaic reads, "Love dwells here." But the room is empty. Dust curls on the floor tiles. And in the bedroom, a single sandal remains beneath the bed. Was it forgotten or left on purpose? There's something achingly human about that. Loneliness wasn't always sorrowful. Sometimes it was chosen, embraced. The philosopher Seneca praised solitude, calling it a temple where one meets the self. But even he admitted, "On some nights I miss the sound of another breath beside mine. So do you, perhaps. Or maybe you don't. Maybe you just understand it. Let the garden quiet now. Let the sandals rest. Let the ache of empty spaces soften into stillness. Because even in ancient Rome, with all its gods and games and glorious flesh, no one escaped the need to feel known. Not emperors, not slaves, not poets, not you. And here, in the comfort of your own quiet, you honor that truth. You share breath with the forgotten. You stand in solidarity with the once longing. You are not alone in your aloneness. And somehow that makes all the difference. The hush of loneliness still lingers as you move now into Rome's final chamber of desire, not in temples or taverns, not in letters or laughter, but in the place where legacy and longing collide, the tomb. Because even after death, the Romans didn't stop talking about love. You walk slowly now through a necropolis, Rome's city of the dead. Marble sarcophagi rise like quiet altars. Stone plaques mark the resting places of shopkeepers and senators alike. You pass one carved with laurel leaves, another with a faded couple etched hand in hand, forever together, even in silence. Some inscriptions are short and factual. Lucius lived 40 years, 3 months, 6 days. But others ache with sentiment. To my beloved Livia, more faithful than fortune, more gentle than spring, wait for me. These were more than epitaph. They were love letters to eternity. You pause at the tomb of a freed woman named Alia. Her husband commissioned the inscription himself. She warmed our house with her laughter. The gods took her early, but not my memory of her arms. He left room for his own name beneath hers, a space for reunion. That wasn't uncommon. Couples often shared tombs, their carvings arranged like sleeping figures, heads close, hands nearly touching. In Rome, remembrance was power. To forget someone was to kill them twice. So lovers clung to memory. A lock of hair sealed in a jar, a ring inscribed with amor aeternus, eternal love. Some kept perfume bottles sealed tight for decades, their scent fading slower than grief. And for those who didn't love sweetly, even bitter memories found their way into stone. One tomb reads, "He lied often but smiled well. May the gods confuse him." Historians still argue whether that was sarcasm, forgiveness, or both. Death didn't erase passion, it clarified it. One widower was found buried with a flute, the same one his wife had played during their first dance. Another woman requested to be cremated with the sandals her lover once kissed. You sit now at a tomb half buried in ivy. Its inscription is simple. For the one I sang to in spring. No name, no date, just a memory so fragile, so specific, that even the earth seems to hum around it. Romans believed the dead could hear, that tombs were thresholds, not endings. People spoke to the stones, whispering regrets, retelling stories, asking for dreams. On certain festivals like Parentalia, families brought wine and bread to graves, leaving flowers and small gifts. It wasn't spooky, it was familial intimacy, extended beyond time. And of course, desire didn't stop haunting. One lover claimed her deceased husband visited her in dreams, brushing her cheek like he used to before dawn. She told no one except Venus. These weren't ghost stories, they were emotional continuity. The idea that if love was real, it didn't vanish, it just changed form. Even slaves and courtesans, rarely memorialized, sometimes received tokens. One freedman wrote, "Tassilia. She made me laugh when I had no coin. That was worth more than gold." He saved 10 denarii to carve her name in stone. In a society where power decided who got remembered, love tried to sneak its way into permanence. You rise and walk toward a mausoleum overlooking a quiet road. The wind picks up slightly. A carved couple gazes toward the horizon. Their faces are idealized, but their pose is real. Two people leaning in as if caught mid-conversation. And that's the final truth. Roman love was talkative, even in death. Whether bragging or grieving, hopeful or haunted, they etched their hearts into stone, parchment, and rumor. You glance back one last time. The necropolis is dim now, moonlight brushing stone lips and marble eyelids. Let that image soften behind your eyes. Let it fade. Because memory, like love, doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just sits quietly beside you, steady as a grave marker, patient as a vow. And tonight, in honoring their desire to be remembered, you become part of that memory. Softly now. Quietly, they're listening. And now your steps slow. You've walked through boudoirs and brothels, through scrolls and whispers, temples and tombs. You've traced the curve of Roman desire from public proclamations to the quietest breath beside a flickering oil lamp. But before this long, winding journey draws to its close, you pause in one last space, not a place on any map, but a feeling, the in-between, the space between love and longing, between passion and power, between what the Romans wanted and what they dared admit. Because for all their blunt graffiti and scandalous poetry, Romans were just like you, just like anyone. They ached to be held, yes, but also to be understood. To be wanted not just for a moment, but in a way that outlasted the wine and the fever and the fading perfume. You sit now in the corner of a Roman insula. An apartment, modest, tucked between a bakery and a bathhouse. A couple once lived here. No marble floors, no statues. Just worn clay cups on a shelf. A single oil lamp, a blanket patched 3 times. We don't know their names, we only know the words etched into the plaster by the doorway. You came home late, but you came home. That was enough. It's not grand, it's not tragic, but it's honest, and maybe that's the most Roman thing of all, because despite all the myths, the statues, the plays, and the poetry, desire in ancient Rome was still messy, ordinary, full of contradictions, a place where a man could whisper promises beneath cypress trees and then forget them by morning, where a woman might pray for love and then slam the door when it finally knocked, where sex was often about power, yes, but where even power sometimes gave way to something softer, something like hope. Historians still argue whether Romans ever truly believed in romantic love the way we do now. But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe love didn't need a name to be real. Maybe it was just there, in the warmth of a shared bath, in the echo of footsteps returning home, in a letter dropped under a door, unsigned. You close your eyes now, and the sounds of Rome drift away. Sandals on stone, laughter in courtyards, a flute somewhere off-key. The dust settles, the oil lamps dim, and the city exhales at last. Let your breath slow with it. You've wandered through centuries tonight, through bodies and blushes and bold confessions, through gods and ghosts and crumbling scrolls. And now, as the final shadows lengthen and your bed becomes your chariot to dreams, you don't need anything else, not names, not statues, not even history, just the feeling of having been there, just the whisper of love that lingered longer than marble, just the truth, soft and undeniable. Desire always outlives the body, even in Rome. And now, with everything told and every echo quieted, you can let the final scenes fade. The flicker of a torch on a villa wall, the hush of silk drawn over bare shoulders, a coin pressed into a lover's palm, a letter tucked beneath a wine jug, all the fragments of ancient longing drifting into stillness like falling ash. Let your body grow heavier now. Let the muscles soften, the shoulders sink, the breath draw longer. You've walked through a world that burned hot with ambition and cooled slowly with longing. A world where even power couldn't protect against a fluttering heart. You've seen how Rome loved, awkwardly, boldly, tenderly, and often foolishly, but always deeply human. The kind of love that leaves behind fingerprints on clay pots and half-written verses behind bedroom curtains. Let that hum through you now, like a lullaby in a language older than sleep. There's nothing left to analyze, no scrolls to translate, no statues to interpret, just you here in the dark, wrapped in the same quiet that wrapped the ancient world when the streets finally stilled and the oil lamps went out one by one. No one's watching, no gods to impress, no senators to debate. Just you and the softness of knowing that across all of time, someone else once wanted what you want. Closeness, warmth, understanding. Let your thoughts stretch like ivy over stone. Let the silence hold you. And when the dreams arrive, let them come gently, like footsteps returning home.